Right. Time has come. Hello. Good afternoon. Microphone. Microphone. I see no microphone. That's a light, Rasheen. No.
It should be maybe.
No idea. Can you hear me? Stacey, can you hear me? Splendid. Right. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for coming. There is a sense, of course, in which none of us really want to be here for this event, which, as you know, is to commemorate our dear friend and the former secretary of this association, John McNeill. I like this one best, probably, as the welcome slide. But it was pointed out to me by Rasheen that the shirt is far superior in this image. And I hope we will be remembering John with laughter and affection as well as with sadness. There are a couple of thanks I want to give in advance. After John died, it seemed a very obvious thing to do for us to have this sort of event to commemorate him. And a convening team was improvised, consisting of myself, Jana Gajdashova, Alex Buchanan, Manuel Antonio Castiñeiras Gonzalez. And we were, have I forgotten someone? Julian. How can I forget Julian? And the awkward squad, always useful to have them. And Julian, of course. Sorry, I am actually losing many of my cognitive faculties. Yes. So I'd like to thank them in the first place. We came up collectively with scores of names, and we had to whittle it down to the people who are speaking at this conference, where we have tried, not entirely successfully perhaps, to balance those people from the British Archaeological Association and those from John's wider European community of colleagues and friends. There was a time when it seemed like it was going to be full of Goths, which we had to slightly, we had to haul in some young Romanesques in order not for this to seem like a concert by the pop brand The Cure, which I hope we've done. And the speakers who have agreed to speak are a tremendous lineup. And they are vivid testimony to the high regard in which John was held as a scholar, as well as to the deep affection in which he was held. And I suppose it is also a sort of testimony to him that we have a mixture of very senior scholars and some perhaps slightly less senior. And of course, one of the great things about John was the level of support that he provided to all of us. I see nodding in the audience from some quite senior and some not so senior heads indeed. So I don't want to talk for too long, so I will basically stop, except by beginning by thanking the conference secretaries, Anne Hignell and Catherine Milburn, who are like the dream team of conference secretarial activities. And again, in some ways, a real testimony to another of John's skills, which is in recruiting very able people to do jobs for the BAA. Anyway, they have taken nearly all the concerns away from me in organising this. Of course, he said to me when I was to become publicity officer that it was the easiest job with the lightest workload of any on the BAA Council. But hey, you can't be right all the time. So yes, I hope we all have a splendid few days. And with that, I will hand over to the first of our chairs, who is the aforementioned Manuel Castiñeiras. Manuel.
Richard, can I just say something
Oh,
about
yes,
toilets?
sorry. Do you see what I mean?
Very, very important feature of any conference, and knowing where they are is very important indeed. And there aren't that many here, and if they're rather hidden. But anyway, the easiest ones to find are you go out of the door, you turn left, then right, and then they'll be on your left-hand side. And then
Did you see the way she used left for right and right for left?
No, this wasn't starting, it hasn't improved.
Okay.
And also there's one upstairs just past the reception desk, and there is another one somewhere else, but if I tell you how to get to that one, you would never come back to this. But it's just you need to build in time to go to the loo because there's not that many of them. I think that's all I've got to say. We're all in the same place. I don't have to think about trips or people missing coaches, which is marvellous.
Where are we having tea, Kate?
Oh, in the common room.
Oh, in
the
the common
room, you have to be quite patient. They're going to have 2 stations. It will be a bit of a probably bun fest or coffee tea fest. But anyway, that's what they have. And they have been very, very helpful, really has, I must say.
Good. Thanks.
Okay.
Not
No,
It's a line.
it's not.
So I have to shout.
Yes.
So it's a big honor to be the chair of this first session. We have a wonderful panel of speakers to start. You know that the system is that each of you has 25 minutes to talk, and questions will be later, no, in the pause. So that our first speaker is very well known, is the Professor Eric Fernie. Eric Fernie, as you know, is emeritus professor of the Courtauld Institute, where he was director for many years. And as you know, he wrote a lot of books about Romanesque art, especially the book about Romanesque architecture. And as well, he wrote a wonderful book about Anglo-Saxon art and the history of art and its methods. But today, he's going to start remembering John McNeill with this topic, John McNeill and the study of the Romanesque. Please, come.
Well, good afternoon. Is how shall I put it? An infinitely. No, I don't know. It's a conditional pleasure to be here speaking, if you see what I mean. I need my glasses. John contributed so much to the study of the Romanesque, helping organize conferences on the subject, then editing volume after volume of them, spending huge amounts of his time as secretary of the BAA, where he not only did most of the organizing on those visits, but he contributed to the thinking and the reassessments which arose from it. And of course, there are his scholarly works. My thanks here to Richard Plant for providing John's bibliography and to Ron Baxter for confirming it. What appears to be his earliest publication is a delightful surprise, given the breadth of its coverage, as it is his volume on Normandy, no surprise there, but in the Blue Guide series, covering every relevant thing under the sun of every date from the Roman Empire to the Second World War. In a way, it encapsulates what was to be true of his future. Sorry,
I just need to sort some mic. Pocket icon.
Yes, should be one there, is there? Oh, it's on. Yes. Right. Okay. Right. Thank you. Let me see where I was. Oh yes, the Blue Guide series, covering every relevant thing under the sun and every date from the Roman Empire to the Second World War. In a way, it encapsulates what was to be true of his future research. That is, within any given context, both wide-ranging and detailed. The bibliography also ends with a chronological surprise, as his article of 2023 concerns 19th and 20th centuries, that is, via the historiography of Old Sarum. Now, I need to change to the next slide. This is the article that most encapsulates his thinking on the Romanesque, the subject of this talk. The Latin, by the way, the quote is from a 12th century document by John of Salisbury. This is an article packed with information. And if you want an indication of that, if you haven't got this figure in your head, 94 footnotes, filling 6 pages in very small print. So you can imagine just how much detail there is there. Here, John produces multiple clear examples supporting the importance of the Roman past in the buildings of the Romanesque period. First, perhaps the most famous example, Speyer Cathedral, based on a Roman imperial building because it was built for an emperor. Then there are the spolia, where John understandably adopts the very useful categories proposed by David Stocker and Paul Everson as casual, functional, and iconic. He begins his study of the iconic with 2 examples which he considers, interestingly, only just qualify. First, now I have to change slides again. Yes. San Pere de Rhodes, a transept looking from south to north. There is this reuse of columns in this building in the first half of the 11th century. These columns are almost unique in Catalonia at this time. The explanation for their use here lies in the unusually close relationship of the church to, you've guessed it, the papacy. This included immunity to episcopal oversight and the right to appeal directly to the Pope. Hence, they could be a reference to the city of Rome with all its columnar basilicas. This John prefers to refer to as elusive reuse, not quite iconic, but rather than iconic, a fine distinction indeed. His second example is St. Augustine's at Canterbury, and this was begun rebuilding by Abbot Scotland in 1072. 2 columns, which you can see stand out there, retained from one of the previous churches on the site, are reused in the crypt of the new presbytery, which could symbolize how the new church was built on the pillars of the old. It is also significant that Scotland was buried near them. Right, but this example, on the contrary, is by definitely not a marginal example. This is absolutely clear, contrasting with those 2 earlier ones. The late 11th century church of St. Albans. This is the reuse of the Anglo-Saxon shafts in the east wall of the transept, which you can see there. Their purpose being to refer to the distant past when Alban was martyred. That assumption can be made because they stand out dramatically from the Norman elements because of their complete lack of articulation. Indeed, as a statement of its opposite, notable especially in those shafts which are extremely thin. Their position on the east wall of the transept would have made them visible from the west at the same time as St. Alban's shrine in the east arm. Monte Cassino provides an even clearer example of the iconic because in its, because it is documented. Desiderius from 1066 brought numerous columns, bases, etc. from Rome, which Leo in his 12th century chronicle makes clear were used to refer to late antiquity and especially Old St. Peter's. Then there's Saint-Saëns in Toulouse, which has explicit references in its architectural sculpture to the early Christian period, and hence to the 3rd century date of the martyred saint. The capitals on the outside of the ambulatory wall modelled closely on antique prototypes, leading to similar forms on the high altar of 1096 and 2 nave portals of the 12th century. And then also abstract, noteworthy example of the effects of spolia in stylistic terms is the appearance of capitals without astragals in where Apulia and Basilicata around 1200, which must be based on Roman capitals reused in the earlier crypts of the 2 areas, and hence can be seen as a reference to the Roman past. So, suitably wide coverage, including the Empire, England, Spain, Italy, and France. And what better way is there of summing up John's study than by quoting his own conclusion? Quote, "This paper opened with the Mirabilia Orbis Romae and closed with a few observations about the importance of locality. Implicit to it is the question of whether there is a discernibly Romanesque sense of the past, an attitude or set of approaches different to that encountered in, say, the 14th century or the 4th. Insofar as there is an answer, it lies in the frequency in which one encounters allusions to Rome, or at least to a past which was shaped before Charlemagne entered Italy. These allusions are, for the most part, locally accented and maybe aesthetic in their motivation, as they are ideologically explicit, but they are persistent and geographically wide-ranging. It is here that 11th and 12th century buildings differ from those of the 14th century, and this that underpins the term Romanesque. As a coda, one should also add that architectural Romanitas is just one element in the visual expression of a much larger world, an intellectual engagement with the past that can be seen in the writings of Anselm, or Alberic of Monte Cassino, or Hildebert of Lavardin, or in the tendency of history in the 11th and 12th centuries to be written within a tradition of the writing of history, of Helgaud's Life of Robert the Pious, of the work of John of Salisbury. Bernard of Chartres was clearly not the only potential Romanesque patron to have seen himself as a dwarf on the shoulder of giants, unquote. And here are the other articles that I've selected to comment on. And I need to change a page, get it separated. Right, Charroux is there because of the Holy Sepulchre, Sainte because of the complexities of its design, the parish church because of the variety of its subjects, and the Herefordshire School because it is centred on sculpture rather than architecture. So, starting with Charroux, and there we have the plan. Saint-Sauveur is very unusual in the mixture of clarity and complexity of its associations and symbolism. Given this, John's text is beautifully clear, which is saying something about a study of one of the most complicated buildings of the Romanesque period. The clarity is evident already in the identity and order of the article's 4 sections: history, architecture, meaning, and imitation. Really goes well. He contrasts the masonry techniques, the architectural detail, and the sculpture, which are all local in character, with the plan, which is anything but. The date of the building centres around a council held there in 1082, with the crypt being inserted shortly after, possibly by the consecration in 1096. As a holy sepulchre, it is closer to the Jerusalem building than any other church in the West, such as the Carolingian church at Fulda, remodeled in the late 11th century, and the Holy Sepulchre at Paderborn, consecrated in 1036. The two possibly the most closely linked to Charroux in the West, though it is more complicated than they are. Then on to Saint-Eutrope at Saintes. In this article, John is dealing with the remains of the church dating from the late 11th and early 12th centuries, namely the crypt and raised presbytery, the transepts, and part of the south nave wall. Urban II consecrated the altar of the upper church in 1096, along with the translation of the relics of Saint-Eutrope. There is an eyewitness account, probably of circa 1100, which has been widely quoted in the literature, but as it had not been published in full, John included it in an appendix with let me see now, and reprinted from the document in the Bibliothèque Nationale. He describes the design as different from anything else in late 11th century Saint-Ange. And here's the aisle, or view of it. The arches separating the bays of the aisle are certainly strikingly odd, having their two sides springing from very different heights. This was one of the many moments where I found myself standing with John and debating how to explain them. Next, the parish church. Reading John's articles, I am struck again and again by the number of subjects he investigates. His study of the parish church in England around 1200 provides examples of this. On the architecture, he examines the presence or absence of towers and their regional variations, and then aisles. While aisles were used before the conquest, as at Wing in Buckinghamshire, he argues that they started to become popular in the late 11th century, as at Ickleton in Cambridgeshire. Their function is a complicated issue. Burials offer one practical explanation, and their visual effect an aesthetic one. This is what you would expect in a study of the parish church. But in addition, John closely engages with the documentary evidence, despite it being so sparse on that subject, the subject of parish churches at that time. This enables him to explore the social dimension, especially who was responsible for what and why, including the basic changes in church ownership in the 12th century. The Herefordshire School. The Herefordshire School of Sculpture has been identified as consisting of about 20 sites, so there is plenty of material to examine. As John says, the previous approach to the subject had been chiefly to do with identifying the patrons of the buildings containing the sculptures, whereas he concentrates on the workshop that carved them, produced them, how it was organized, how it varied in size, and how it worked. As to its dates, he broadly accepts the decades of the 1130s, 40s, and 50s, but on sources, he has some disagreements with George Janetsky. Now, before I mention those, I want to refer to something that is more than a disagreement I have with John. Indeed, to indicate that my paper is not an encomium, which can only be positive, I have to say I think he is wrong when he argues that the tympanum of St. Giles at Aston sorry, I've lost my place. Yes. I think he is wrong when he argues that the tympanum of St. Giles at Aston is unfinished because it is so shallow. To me, because the surface appears to be consistent and not the result of a work in progress, I can take it as just an example of very low relief. Of course, it's highly likely, perhaps I should say inevitable, that there are those among us who think John is right. But even if that turns out to be the case, I suspect that it would not be because of the relief being so shallow. But even if my assessment is reduced from criticism to just a disagreement, I hope you nonetheless accept it for the encomium point. And having mentioned the criticism, I have to add how difficult it was to find one. So back to John's disagreements with Darnetsky. And here another slide. Yep. So, for example, he derives the figures on the jambs of the chancel arch at Kilpatrick, this is Janetsky, from Santiago, whereas John notes that the figures at Santiago stand beneath an arch and are attached to the shaft of a column, neither of which applies at Kilpatrick. And whereas Janetsky describes Western France as another source for Kilpatrick, John points out that the relevant features, such as radial voussoirs and animals which bite their tails, were already in use at, for example, Old Sarum and Lullington. So re the Herefordshire School, what strikes me most about this study is the care with which John examines the evidence, the wide range of conclusions he draws from it, and the detail of his method. As usual, a great scholarly combination, and one of John's most important contributions. And the last slide. So, to conclude, and to do so on a personal note, I had so many useful and enjoyable discussions with John on the subjects we were working on. And on one article, we combined that on buildings in England for Neil Stratford's book on the Cluniac order. And when I stood in for him because of a clash of dates on a Martin Randall guided tour, he provided me with very extensive and helpful notes about the whole thing, including what to do when there were problems. And those problems were both the biggest, such as the unexpected closure of a building scheduled to be visited over several hours, and the smallest, such as complaints about breakfast. So, how fulfilling it has been reading his publications again, for their own worth, obviously, but also because they reminded me of when he was a student at East Anglia. Enthusiastic, inquisitive, and clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, for your paper. Our second speaker.
Oh, you've got the microphone there.
Oh, well, please take it out and unhook it.
Oh no, it's in his glasses. Oh no.
Yeah.
Ah,
Now there is microphone. So thank you very much, Eric, for this paper. So we have our second speaker. He's Gerhard Lutz. I think that you know him. He has just arrived from the USA. Currently, he's curator of the Cleveland Museum of Art at Cleveland. And he was the former curator of Hildesheim, at Hildesheim Museum. Currently, he's preparing a big exhibition about Philip the Good of Burgundy. The exhibition is going to be in Dijon and Cleveland 27-28. But today, he's going to talk about a crucifixion Dolorosus in the Cleveland Museum of Art, an art around 1200.
yeah. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm very grateful, deeply grateful for being part of this conference here. I'm grateful to the organizers, and I'm 120% certain that John is or would be extremely excited to see us all here talking about medieval art and meeting. And it's sort of a family meeting in his honor, although we all have mixed feelings. But I think we have to imagine that he would be really hugely excited about this event. The following presentation is probably maybe the most shocking paper for you, not because we are quickly moving from Romanesque architecture to Gothic, moving from architecture to sculpture, but because of the theme and the character of the sculptures I'm going to talk about. Today, I would like to introduce you to a sculpture in the collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art that first caught my attention about 20 years ago and has remained on my radar ever since. But let us take things one step at a time. The object entered the Cleveland collection in 1981 when it was acquired from a Viennese art dealer. Unfortunately, as is so often the case, no further details of its provenance are known. So we must rely entirely on the work itself as our primary evidence. The sculpture is carved in walnut, a material that would not be unusual for a piece probably made in the 14th century in the Rhineland or the Cologne region. I'll talk about in a few minutes. Measuring 41.5 to 36.8 centimeters, it is one of the smaller examples of this type. The cross itself is lost. The arms are made of a somewhat lighter colored wood and may have been added at a later date. However, the damage to the hand suggests that this alteration could be older. Other additions and reworkings can also be observed on the corpus. This mainly concerns the chest, which appears to be a more recent insertion. The extent to which this reflects the original state remains to be seen. And I hope you can see here the contours of this later edition, or more recent edition. Some of the spines of the crown are missing. Several teeth and parts of the freely carved curls have been broken off, and replaced. The ends of the cascading drapery have also been broken off or added later. The crucifix was originally painted, but it has been completely stripped in more recent times, leaving only a few traces visible today. Remnants of the chalk ground, bits of flesh paint, blood on the head and on the right side of the body, and touches of green on the crown of thorns. The body of Christ is carved in the round, but the back was not worked out in the same detail. This suggests that it could be seen from the side and probably from behind. Even at first glance, the emaciated body is striking, with the chest projecting prominently. This stands in contrast to the sculptural emphasis on the loincloth, which accentuates the elongated form of the figure. A few voluminous folds structure the cloth and in turn sharpen the viewer's perception of the body's apparent fragility. The head of Christ hangs low, so that the face is not immediately visible. The viewer must step closer in order to look directly into Christ's face. What then appears is an intensely expressive visage. The eyes are nearly closed, and the mouth is open in a contorted expression, as if Christ were still hanging in agony on the cross. This sight, above all, must have had a shocking impact on the viewer. Is he dead, or does he still cling to life? It becomes clear that the work is meant to be experienced at close range and from multiple angles. Nevertheless, the most relevant comparative examples are found primarily in monumental sculpture. The Crucifixus Dolorosus in St. Maria in Capitol in Cologne, also carved from walnut, is the most obvious point of comparison. The work in the former convent church measures 175 centimeters in length and is dated to around 1304 on the basis of written sources. It also offers an impression of the sculpture's original polychrome appearance, although the paint layer visible today is from a second campaign applied after 1400, during which the number of wounds was increased. Even from a distance, the sculpture's unusual design is striking, particularly the prominent protruding ribcage and the deeply lowered head, which show clear parallels with the Cleveland Christ. Here too, particular emphasis is placed on the head, which hangs so low that the face can only be seen when viewed directly in front of the figure. The largely freely carved curves frame a face with hollow features. On closer inspection, the mistreated body, marked by stylized plague-like wounds, originally distributed evenly across the upper torso, becomes apparent. The sophisticated design posed particular challenges for both the carver and the painter, who were highly conscious of their artistic means. The body and legs are carved from a single block of walnut. However, some elements projecting from the block had to be added separately, including the arms, the right knee, the two tips of the loincloth, and the heel of the left foot. Special attention was given to the head. It is constructed in several parts, with the face above the upper lip glued on like a mask. The compositional principles seen in the Cologne sculpture are adapted here to a small format work in the Cleveland corpus. These include a deeply sunken head, which invites the viewer to approach the sculpture closely. On both crucifixes, the hair falls partly free, framing the face. The mouth is open expressively, revealing the teeth, suggesting a reaction to the agony of the crucifixion rather than speech. The haggard facial features carved with a gouge are especially striking and evocative. At the same time, the Cleveland figure differs from the work in St. Maria im Capitol. The body is rendered extremely thin and almost fragile. Furthermore, the depiction of the hanging differs fundamentally. In the Cleveland example, it adheres more closely to traditional crucifix types, with a less drastic portrayal of the suspended body. The differing settings likely played a decisive role in these design choices. The crucifix in St. Maria im Capitol was probably displayed in a somewhat elevated position, not intended for close viewing, though it is unlikely to have functioned as a triumphal cross. Vivian Bienert has recently argued that it may have been placed directly above the Holy Cross altar in connection with the choir screen. By contrast, the small scale and meticulous workmanship of the Cleveland sculpture suggest that it was intended to be viewed at close range, likely designed primarily for private devotion. How then might we imagine this experience? The use of images is comparatively well documented for female convents, for which numerous written sources survive. According to these sources, we can expect to find images placed outside the church in the enclosure area at various possible locations, including the cloister. In St. Katharinenthal in northern Switzerland, for example, a crucifix stood in the cloister, presumably near the chapter house, to which, according to the sister's book, one of the nuns, Richmuth, directed her lamentations during an illness. Another crucifix was located in the chapter house itself, in front of which the sisters also offered their private prayers. In the Dominican convent in Töss near Winterthur in Switzerland, a crucifix even hung in the cellar, where it was intended to drive away evil spirits. Crucifixes are frequently mentioned in the sources, though their precise locations are often not specified. Despite their relatively open accessibility within the convent, these works of art allowed the sisters to engage with them intimately. This is especially true for pieces that were brought into the convent for the private use of individual members in contravention of the order's rules. However, such works were probably very small in scale, even smaller than my example, which makes it less likely that the Cleveland crucifix was intended for this purpose. Margarete Ebner in Maria Mödingen, for example, had a parlor in an adjoining room of the convent church, from which she could attend mass and listen to the choir singing of her fellow sisters during her long periods of illness. Among the furnishings was a large crucifix, for which she had a particularly intense devotion and even took it to bed. As fascinating as these accounts are, we must recognize that we generally know nothing about the precise appearance of these works. They have either not survived, or in the case of existing pieces, their provenance is unclear today. In other words, we have no reliable information about the exact size. Even when sources describe a sculpture as large as in Mödingen, this must be understood from the perspective of the author, who related it to comparable contexts that are largely inaccessible to us today. The Cleveland crucifix, at the very least, appears to have been designed to elicit an emotional response from the viewer through its close-up engagement. It is also tempting to focus on female convents or monasteries in general. A crucifix from the parish church in Enånger in Hälsingland, Sweden, which was made of elder wood and has a corpus height of 33 centimeters, seems to contradict this. Aaron Andersson suspected that it was imported from the Rhineland or Westphalia and was made in the first third of the 14th century. And this is just to be aware of the location of this crucifix in Sweden. And here's a look at the church itself. This is a normal parish church which was built in the 15th century. So we do not have any evidence for the original placement of the older crucifix. Apart from that, there is a crucial difference. Although the Inonga crucifix can be compared with the Cleveland example in terms of size and the accentuated traces of blood, the sculptural treatment is fundamentally different. In Cleveland, the body and face are depicted in drastically shocking forms, a quality that is entirely absent in the Swedish crucifix. Strictly speaking, it cannot be considered a Crucifixus Dolorosus, or this character was conveyed solely through the polychrome surface. I would also like to mention this example in the Museum Schnütgen in Cologne, although it was probably made several decades later, and exhibits clear differences in the treatment of the body. Let us return to the period around 1300. The crucifix in St. Maria im Capitol in Cologne, which according to later tradition was erected in 1304, appears abruptly in the art of this period. Both its placement within the history of piety and the reconstruction of its stylistic context continue to pose challenges for scholars today. And yet, the shocking depiction of the crucifix in St. Maria im Capitol is not without precedent. One contributing factor was the flourishing of the mendicant orders in the 13th century, which marked a turning point that significantly influenced piety, not only in urban centers. Numerous texts from this period were authored by members of these orders, particularly by nuns. Another relevant aspect is the veneration of Christ's blood. An illustrative example comes from the Zurich Dominican nun Elsbeth von Oye, who died around 1350, who believed that nothing was more pleasing to God than the bleeding wounds of his son. She sought to assimilate herself to the suffering of Christ and inflicted passions upon herself. This raises an important question. Where can the artistic roots of the Crucifixi Dolorosi be found? The similarities between the Cleveland crucifix and the one in St. Maria im Capitol suggest that the Cleveland work was likely created in Cologne. However, the latter appears to have been produced in the early years of the 14th century without any direct predecessors. The origins of the artists have been the subject of much scholarly discussion. Robert Sokale, for example, considered Strasbourg and the Upper Rhine as possible points of origin, while Gerhard Hoffmann drew parallels with crucifixes by Giovanni Pisano. In 2007, I largely agreed with this assessment in a study on Gothic sculpture, where I was unable to fully substantiate these connections. The closest parallels can be found in the art of the Upper Rhine in the last third of the 13th century, such as the strikingly wrinkled form of the garments on the figures of the buttresses, on the buttresses of the south side of the Freiburg Minster nave from around 1260-70, and the figures on the west portals of the Strasbourg Minster. In Giovanni Pisano's work, we find an intense focus on the sunken human body of Christ, which suggests a commitment to the same artistic questions. In 2014, Jürgen Wiener argued that Pisano most likely spent time in Strasbourg and that reflections of this day can be found in his artistic work. In this respect, it is plausible that the Italian artist received significant impulses from the Upper Rhine. It is surprising, however, that art historians have rarely considered migration from the Upper Rhine to Italy, instead tending to view the area south of the Alps as the primary source of inspiration. Geographically, we are largely speaking of a region stretching from Cologne along the Upper Rhine to the Lake Constance area and into northern Switzerland, with Strasbourg as one of its key centers. This corresponds closely with one of the major spiritual hubs of the period. Looking beyond purely stylistic influences, a spiritual and artistic epicenter emerges, one that shaped numerous new types of images in the decades around 1300 and simultaneously set standards in piety. The Crucifixus Dolorosus was likely created within this milieu, and the similarities with Giovanni Pisano can be explained by his engagement with the same artistic sources. And this brings us to a question of particular relevance. Why are there so few small format examples of this type, with almost all surviving depictions being monumental? Even in Cologne and the Rhineland, where comparatively many examples have survived, the drastic nature of the imagery was quickly tempered and simplified. Could it be that the shocking depiction in large format works, usually elevated and viewed from a distance, was less brutal, less controversial, and therefore more acceptable? It is easy to imagine that a work such as the Cleveland Crucifix would have been challenging for contemporary viewers, as it remains today. It is therefore quite plausible that the choice of format in Crucifixi Dolorosi was directly related to the manner of depiction. A shockingly emaciated body may have been too intense in a small, close-up format, making it easier to convey its impact by emphasizing a more moderate human form. Giovanni Pisano's crucifixes too ultimately had no direct successors in their extreme expression, and their influence persisted only through more tempered reinterpretations. Although we lack sources on this point, we must consider the viewer's reactions and the long-term effects of revolutionary pictorial representations in order to fully understand the changes in depictions of the crucified and their relationship to scale. Let me conclude with a quick look into the future. In the fall of 2028, an exhibition dedicated to art around 1300 will take place at the Cleveland Museum of Art, of course, offering a welcome opportunity to revisit this object and consider it in relation to other works from the same period, such as the group with Christ in St. John, one of the other masterpieces of Cleveland's medieval collection. Thank you very much for your attention.
To the light hand. So thank you very much, Gerhard, for this fascinating talk with all these wonderful images. And now we have the third speaker, who is Costanza Beltrami. Currently, Costanza is senior lecturer in the University of Stockholm. And today he's going to talk about Spanish topic. So the title of the paper is Unexpected Connections, Making Sense of Spanish Gothic in 19th Century London and Beyond. Okay.
Yeah, it's good. I have, yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I usually speak super loudly. So if you think it's too much with the microphone, please tell me and I can take it off. But it is great to be here today, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for organizing this conference in memory of John. And in this paper, you know, it's going to be even more shocking than before, because I'm going to take us away from the Middle Ages to turn to the reception of Spanish Gothic architecture in Victorian England. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the cast courts of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And these immersive, intriguing spaces have been studied extensively in recent years, especially in light of the restoration completed in 2018. And there's also been a lively interest in the collection of Spanish decorative arts at the museum. However, studies have tended to focus on the monumental cast of the Portico de la Gloria from Santiago, and also on casts of Islamic and Islamicate works. And sorry, my slides are not changing. Okay, no. Okay. Okay, so here you have the cast courts, and you also have the cast of the Portico de la Gloria and of Santa Maria la Blanca. There are other Spanish casts I won't really be talking about. Because the cast I'm going to discuss is the cast of the corner of the cloister of San Juan de los Reyes, which is a Franciscan convent begun in 1477 in Toledo. And this has been discussed less extensively. And here you can see the cast on this side, and on the other side, it's the actual convent with kind of the real element. And this cast offers a useful lens to consider broader issues of perception, interpretation, and international scholarly exchange. And my topic is obviously far from John's main interest in Romanesque art, but I hope that it nevertheless speaks to experiences that were important to him. And one is the value of travel as a way of learning about architecture. Another is the importance of scholarly exchange across borders. And also my presentation brings us back to Victorian London at a time when the British Archaeological Association was still quite new. And so you have to know that in my imagination, this entire paper is played out at the Society of Antiquarians with people on the BAA committee as like the main characters. And the paper has 4 parts. And first I introduce the cast courts at the South Kensington Museum. Then I consider San Juan de los Reyes as a canonical building reproduced in stone, text, and images. Next, I discuss the commission of the plaster cast, including some little-known archival documents and drawings. And finally, I analyze the architectural discourses underpinning the decision to copy specifically this building. And this is another image of the building to give you an idea of it. So on 19 April 1873, the Architect magazine previewed the architectural courts about to open at South Kensington. The reviewer ignored the hustle and bustle of construction that you can see here to recreate a complete, orderly image of the site. In addition to the pre-existing enormous casts of Trajan Column and of the Portico de la Gloria, the reviewer noted newly commissioned copies, including some works from Spain. And this says that near to the Compostela gateway is a cast of great elegance, an arch of what is now a Christian church, but was formerly a Jews' synagogue in Toledo. The delicate forms of Moorish architecture, even though given in only a single arch and without the accessory of gorgeous color, may suffice to convey some notion of the rich effect of the original building, which must have resembled, and indeed may have served as a prototype, for the present Grand Hebrew Synagogue at Pest. A doorway from San Juan de los Reyes, Toledo, is interesting as showing the Spanish type of Gothic architecture in its decadence, graceful but feeble, and indicative of the gradual decay of energy, which was soon to effloresce in Churrigueresque absurdities. In striking contrast to this stands opposite the Schreier monument from St. Sebald's Church at Nuremberg. The comparison between the synagogue of Santa Maria la Blanca, built in the 12th century, and the great synagogue completed in 1859 in Budapest offers an oblique introduction to the aims of the architectural court. Cutting across time, it evokes the educational mission of the South Kensington Museum, initially part of a broader department of science and art that included schools for professional craftsmen and artists. The museum collected historical objects in large numbers, but these were not necessarily chosen for their historical value. Rather, in the words of the museum's first director, Henry Cole, works of different technique and date were selected to offer examples of art easily consultable by the public who were consumers, by the manufacturer who were producers, and by artists and artisans who were students, with the aim of improving taste and the competitiveness of British design and industry. The architectural courts furthered this broad educational mission by making foreign architectural structures tangible to those who could not travel. According to some, Casts were even more educative than original buildings, since, in theory, they could be arranged at will to tell histories of architecture unhampered by distance or accessibility. The aspiration for an orderly museum of reproductions was widely held by scholars around Europe and repeated in London when a small architectural museum opened in 1852. And here you can see some images of it. In a lecture of 1853, the architectural historian James Ferguson argued that only a museum of casts established on cosmopolitan and scientific principles could help architects and artisans gather the knowledge necessary to create buildings appropriate to their time. And such a museum should be organized by class. So here you see different architectural elements together, and also by date and by place, with clearly labeled and unpainted casts. In contrast, the cast courts at South Kensington are cluttered and heterogeneous, resisting a single directional narrative. In 1899, a US publication stated that there were probably few museums which are more unscientifically arranged, where it is more difficult for the student to seize upon the salient points of any special exhibit, to grasp its effect in its original position and its true place in the sequence of styles. In the arrangement, everything is sacrificed to the making of an artistic show, to elevate the public as it is pretended, to please and amuse, in fact. Order was perhaps an impossible ideal, given that the relative value of architecture produced in different styles, periods, and regions was the subject of vociferous debate in the 19th century. The casts could be related in multiple and changing ways. And the Architects' Review that we talked about before reveals as much, as the text follows diverse threads among the objects. First size, then geographical origin, and finally contrasting quality. And also connections that may have been self-evident at the opening of the cast courts in 1873 may have lost some of their meaning by 1889, the time of the criticism, and even more so today. Opinions of Spanish art were especially prone to change, since knowledge was expanding radically at this time. At the beginning of the century, Spain and England were allies in the Peninsular War. In the following years, even more numerous travelers visited the Andalusi monuments in the south of the country, and a dedicated Alhambra court was famously recreated at the Crystal Palace. Spain was also the perfect place for a bargain. In a letter of 1866, Charles Robinson, the museum's first curator, wrote that it was the perfect moment to buy Spanish art, since the country was in semi-revolution, impoverished and distressed. Collecting Spain materially and visually seemed urgent and noble. The architect Matthew Digby Wyatt wrote in his illustrated travel book of 1872 that sketching local buildings was snatching a brand from the inevitable fire, since almost under one's eyes, the Spain of history and romance is casting its skin. Knowledge of Spanish Gothic architecture was also growing. Extensive scholarly information became available in 1865 when George Edmund Street responded to the complete ignorance as to the true nature of Gothic architecture in Spain by publishing his important book on the subject. Street's assessment of Spanish architecture was more knowledgeable and positive than that of many contemporaries, who instead saw Spanish architecture as dryly imitative. Yet he was extremely critical of the convent of San Juan de los Reyes, stating that nothing can be much more elaborate than much of the detail of this church. Yet I have seen few buildings less pleasing or harmonious. His dissatisfaction is echoed in the Architects' Review that I mentioned at the start, where the building is described as decadent and feeble. But if the building was seen in this way, why is there a plaster cast copy of it, at all? One answer is that San Juan de los Reyes has always been a canonical building, in spite of the criticism. Its status was ensured by its close connection to the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, whose coats of arms are prominently featured in the decoration, as you can see here. The monarchs founded the convent in 1477, following their success in the civil war that ensured Isabella's position as ruler of Castile. And the church was initially conceived as the monarch's burial site. After the conquest of Granada, the monarch's interest in the building waned, and the cloister was only completed in the 16th century. But nevertheless, this remained a large and well-appointed convent. And visual and documentary evidence suggests that it was a model for other structures, from the parish church of San Andres in Toledo to the convent of Santa Maria del Jesus in Torrijos, and even for an early plan of the church of the Hospital of Tavera, also in Toledo in the mid-16th century. The convent's importance, and perhaps especially the macabre decoration of metal chains from Christian prisoners liberated during the conquest of Granada, made it a favorite stopping point for travelers, from Hieronymus Munzer in 1495 to Albert Juvin de Rochefort in the 1670s, and even Hans Christian Andersen in 1863. Text and images often channel a broader fascination for Spain as a place of chivalric emotion and bygone traditions, as in this book by Samuel Manning. And conveniently, the cloister of San Juan de los Reyes was partially destroyed during the Peninsular War. So in the 19th century, the ruins could become a favorite subject for both foreign and local artists working in a picturesque tradition. And here we have some paintings and drawing by Cecilio Pizarro y Librado, but there's also works in new 19th century media, like the lithographs of Francisco Javier Paseriza, or the color lithographs of John Friedrich Lewis, and then the photographs of Charles Clifford and Jean Laurent. Alternative ways of visualizing the building were also emerging at this time. And notably, in 1848, the professor of drawing Manuel Asa Sierreño published the Album Artístico de Toledo. And this was the first time when the decoration of San Juan de los Reyes was broken down into individual decorative elements, kind of orderly, on the page, well arranged on the page. The isolated details seen here share the aesthetic of educational plaster casts, like the ones recommended by Ferguson. And indeed, the pioneering schools of art and architecture in Spain, notably the Real Academia de San Fernando and the ETSAM, also acquired plaster copies of friezes and decorative elements from San Juan de los Reyes at different times from 1875 onwards. And even before these casts were made, comparable details were circulating in foreign publications. For example, in The Workshop, an American periodical for craftspeople in 1870. And so this helps us understand why the cast would have been commissioned a little bit. And indeed, but its kind of immediate story begins in exactly 1870 with a journey, the study trip taken by Henry Cole in Spain in April, when he visited Vitoria, Burgos, Valladolid, Toledo, Zaragoza, and Pamplona, recording his impressions, purchases, and orders for reproductions in a brief illustrated diary now in the V&A archives. And here are a few pages. With reproductions high on his mind, Cole traveled to Toledo with a photographer of the Laurent Company. And there he met Juan Facundo Riaño, the Spanish scholar who would then become an important and almost legendary advisor for the museum. On 20 April at San Juan de los Reyes, Cole asked Riaño to obtain estimates for casting the corner of the cloister. And just after the trip, he also commissioned the cast of Santa Maria la Blanca, which was, however, completed first. Correspondence between Riaño and the museum enables us to follow all the steps involved in the complex commission of the cast of San Juan de los Reyes. The job was carried out by cast maker José Trilles y Baldenes, under the regular supervision of Riaño, who describes the scaffolding and the gelatin molds used for the project. The cast of Santa Maria la Blanca had arrived broken in London, but that of San Juan de los Reyes was thick and it was well suited to the long journey, months long. The process of constructing packing cases was, however, complex, as no carpenter in Toledo had sufficient wood. And this was a lot because the cast was sent in 113 pieces, alongside this striking drawing with instructions for assembly. And I think from here you can see that it was a monumental project of making, unmaking, and remaking to bring this cast to London. And eventually it arrived on 30 September 1872, so just under 2 years, or over 2 years after being commissioned. As the architectural court was being finalized at South Kensington, Riaño was writing the classified and descriptive catalogue of the art objects of Spanish production in the South Kensington Museum, published in 1872. And the cast of San Juan de los Reyes arrived too late to be included in the book, but luckily Riaño wrote a draft entry that is now in the V&A archive. And so we can compare how San Juan de los Reyes was seen by Coe and by Riaño, who were not only two scholars based in different countries, but also had a very different understanding or depth of understanding of art, because Coe was essentially a public servant and an exhibition organizer, while Riaño was primarily a scholar of decorative arts. And Coe was interested in the corner of San Juan de los Reyes as an example of artistic hybridity. In his diary, he remarks that the doorways that he had copied are most interesting as showing the influence of Moorish art upon Gothic art. On this assessment, Coe and Riaño were surprisingly at odds with each other, and one wonders if they argued about it when they were both, at San Juan de los Reyes. And this is because Riaño describes the cast as of the Gothic or pointed style, and more specifically as flamboyant, without identifying any Islamic elements in the decoration. And this echoes the introduction of the classify and descriptive catalogue, where Riaño notes that Christian art of the Middle Ages developed itself in Spain under its two aspects of Romanesque and pointed, with the same purity and the same system as in countries north of the peninsula. There are numberless monuments of all kinds still existing in Spain, in which it is impossible to trace the lightest Arabian influence. And by Arabian, it just means like Islamic influence. In modern scholarship, San Juan de los Reyes is commonly classified as a Hispano-Flemish building, a term which emphasizes the fusion of Islamic and flamboyant elements, which some scholars have identified in the design. And Riaño's description may therefore appear surprising from our modern perspective today. However, it is in fact in line with contemporary historiography in Spain and beyond. In fact, it was only in the early 20th century that scholars like Vicente Lamperez started discussing the presence of Islamic elements in the architecture of the convent. Street's book of 1865 also describes the convent as purely Gothic. And by noting this, I don't want to imply that Coe's interpretation is somehow more modern or correct than Riaño. And in fact, today the Hispano-Flemish as a concept is somewhat controversial as well. But I think there is an interesting question about what shaped Coe's understanding of the building as a fusion of Moorish and Gothic, if it wasn't Street or his conversations with Riaño when they were at the building together. Since Coe was more of a generalist, perhaps he relied on broader surveys, like those of James Ferguson, the leading architectural historian of the time, and also an advisor to the South Kensington Museum in the production of casts of Indian architecture. Ferguson published a groundbreaking survey of global architecture in 1855, which was then reissued many times in several expanded and updated editions. And today the book is quite difficult to read because of Ferguson's misguided interpretation of architecture as a reflection of essentialized identities, so that in his view, each population's capacity of art was determined by race. And according to him, therefore, Spain's multicultural history meant that the architecture was mixed, imported, and lacked creativity. But in the first edition, Ferguson calls San Juan de los Reyes the gem of its age and stresses the lavish exuberance of its decoration. And decoration is a feature which he emphasizes throughout his analysis of late medieval Spanish architecture. And for example, discussing the Condestable Chapel in Burgos Cathedral, he notes that it is only in Spain that perfect abandon as regards expense and finish is to be found. If any Gothic building exists of equal richness, it is Rosslyn Chapel, the design of which was most probably imported from this part of Spain, every detail and form being easily traced back to the Castiles or to the neighboring provinces. The Rosslyn Chapel mentioned here is, of course, the one located near Edinburgh and established in 1446 as a collegiate church and then burial chapel. The comparison may seem random, but Ferguson, in fact, wrote several articles about this, and he made several connections between Spanish and Scottish architecture overall. And interestingly, a cast of Rosslyn Chapel was completed for South Kensington in 1874, and it has always been displayed back to back with the cloister of San Juan de los Reyes. And now they're like literally back to back with each other. And some time ago, they were kind of next to each other. And so this is San Juan de los Reyes that you see there. In the 1867 edition of his book, Ferguson also argued that the late Gothic in Spain was half German and half Spanish, and more Islamic than earlier Gothic. This idea also appears in earlier texts, notably Edward Freeman's A History of Architecture, published in 1849. This book aimed to interpret architecture as a reflection of civilizations and their change over time, again in a racial light where European and particularly Teutonic cultures were seen to excel above all others. Discussing another late Gothic building, the Vélez Chapel in Murcia Cathedral, Freeman writes, "But the most curious fact of all is that the Renaissance in Spain appears to have assumed, to a certain extent, the character of a closer return to Saracenic forms. This strange mixture, this leaguing of Mahomet and Apollo, to say nothing of Termagant, to destroy the purity of Christian art, was most evident at this chapel, where we have flamboyant paneling, pinnacles, arabesque, arches of all sorts, both actually multifoil and fretted, round, pointed, and elliptical canopies, with the most incredibly large crockets, would-be classical shafts, and columns indescribable. The whole is a wonderful monument of magnificent barbarism." And what is interesting is that Freeman enumerates the variety of ornament rather than pointing out any specific Islamic elements. And for him, over-decoration was both an essentially Islamic feature and a characteristic of flamboyant buildings. And so, for example, talking about the Giralda, the bell tower of Seville Cathedral, begun in 1184 as a minaret, he says that it is a good deal like flamboyant work, for its elaborate tracery is arranged in long rectangular panels. And this is instead like an Islamic motif that now we would call sebka. In turn, flamboyant buildings in France affect a more than Arabian gorgeousness, because every inch is covered with tracery of the richest kind. Every pointed canopy, a feature in which the style delights, is loaded with crockets, distant but large and elaborate. Every arch drips with foliations, hanging free like lacework. In short, in Freeman's text, a discussion of hybrid architecture in Spain coexists with the broader use of Arabic or Saracenic and related adjectives to define all that is overly decorated. This is, in fact, a long-standing Orientalist trope of the East as unrestrained and excessive. And in this view, late Gothic architecture is automatically Islamic or Islamicate if it is richly decorated. My impression is that Cole's description of San Juan de los Reyes may have been based on this commonplace understanding of overflowing decoration as typically Oriental, rather than looking forward to the 20th century construction of the Hispano-Flemish as a distinctive artistic category. Acknowledging this different interpretation encourages us to reflect on how Orientalism informed the museum space and how it may unwillingly continue to shape our interpretation of Spanish late Gothic today. But for the Victorians, looking back at San Juan de los Reyes was in fact looking forward at the possible futures of architecture. For example, in 1884, the architect Robert Gibson considered that the ground plan of San Juan de los Reyes provided the best solution to the difficulties of modern churches in the traditional Gothic styles. And, I agree completely. As I mentioned at the beginning, the cast courts at South Kensington were likewise intended as a laboratory for new architectural ideas. Those who expected clearly marked boundaries between types, styles, and regions were inevitably disappointed. But producing such monumental casts required international connections and encounters between people across space and through time inevitably emerged and re-emerged from the cluttered display in the cast courts. And I wanted to end by saying that this idea of connections really makes me think of John and how he brought many of us together. Thank you for listening. Oh, yes.
So thank you very much, Costanza, for this paper on 19th century perception and reception of Spanish late Gothic. Now it's time for questions. So we have 3 different papers with very different topics. One about John scholarship, the second about this amazing Crucifixus, and the last one about the reception of Spanish late Gothic. So do you have any question for the speakers? I don't know how to proceed. Maybe the speakers come here to answer the questions. Anyone in the audience? So maybe Rose?
Booked on to dinner tomorrow night and fancy some quality seasonal entertainment. There's a really nice concert on at the Cathedral, Britain's Ceremony of Carols and other things like that. So I'll leave some leaflets out the back, or Susan and I have got some flyers if anyone is not having dinner.
Just one very quick notice, everyone.
Just speaking to that.
Okay.
Don't put too far.
Okay, a very quick notice, just so you all know where the reception is after the lectures finish at 6. It will be in the common room where you've just had tea and coffee, so you won't get lost. Okay, bye.
Okay, I take it we've got everybody here who wants to listen. Please sit down as quickly as possible, and because otherwise we'll fall behind, folks, and we can't have that. The BAA never does that. My name's Julian Luxford, and I'm introducing the speakers for this session. Before I do, I just wanted to say Richard Plant has mentioned that, we could have had 4 times as many speakers contributing to this event as we have got. And it's a happy, it's not a coincidence, but it's a happy prospect to think of the Toulouse Romanesque conference in April, and the fact that a lot of speakers who might have spoken here are actually going to speak there as well, and that the booking for that conference is now open on the BAA website. And so anybody who's interested in that, these extraordinary opportunities really come with. Do you want to say something, Richard?
It's another wonderful lineup, and we will be going for visits around Toulouse and to Moissac, and a good time will be had by all, and possibly the odd bowl of cassoulet. Sorry?
Going up to Rocamadour.
We're not going up to Rocamadour because we like to focus.
Stored in the cliff. That challenge, who can resist it?
There are many places to go to, but we didn't have time. But yes, so the booking is open on the BAA website. It's probably better make it relatively quick because it's likely to be quite.
Yes, I think that will sell out quickly, folks. So book early to avoid disappointment. Okay, we've got 4 speakers in this session, and the first of them, I'm not going to give them long introductions, but the first of them is Alexandrina Buchanan, who's the current president of the British Archaeological Association. And I remember John saying to me, not so long ago actually, that he thought Alexandrina would make an excellent secretary of the BAA. And I know why he thinks that too. But Alexandrina is actually our president. But anyway, so I think that that makes it appropriate that Alexandrina speaks to us about past presidents of the BAA.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Secretary, so sorry.
Can everyone no, that's not high enough, is it? Can everyone hear me? It's working. Okay, great. If at any stage you can't, please wave at me from the back. If on the other hand I'm too loud, I can tone it down. So in reflecting on the life and work of John McNeill, in tribute to whose remarkable ability to build networks, support scholars, and embody the sociable dimensions of antiquarian practice we're gathered today, I wanted in this paper to turn that lens back onto the 19th century. And specifically, I'm going to look at the Secretaries of the British Archaeological Association during its foundational decades, roughly from its establishment in 1843 through to the end of the 19th century. And my aim in doing so is twofold. Firstly, to show how attending to the office of Secretary illuminates the working culture, internal tensions and ambitions of the early BAA. And secondly, to suggest how this history helps us to re-envision the nature of the Secretary's role today, especially its intellectual, social and affective dimensions, at a moment when the association must reconfigure that role in the sad light of John's passing. Sorry, slides aren't moving on again. They were earlier.
Yeah, there we go.
Marvellous. What do I have to do?
Oh gosh, up and down now.
Up and down. Marvellous. Okay, thanks, Rasheen. Okay, so the BAA was founded in 1843 by Charles Roach Smith and Thomas Wright, joined shortly afterwards by the surgeon Thomas Pettigrew and the wealthy antiquary Albert Way. Although Way was initially described as honorary secretary, any distinction between his role and Smith's, who was also described as secretary, quickly collapsed into the highly collective, improvised labour structure that characterised the association's early years. The founders' backgrounds reveal much about the nature of the early association. Roach Smith was a wholesale pharmacist in the City of London. Wright was a trade... Oh, sorry. Where are we? Wright was a trade publisher. Pettigrew and William Bromé, another early supporter, were surgeons, and Way, unlike the others, was independently wealthy. What united them was not a shared profession or social class, but a shared antiquarian energy, a willingness to write, publish, collect, correspond, and organise at a time when such labour fell outside formal academic structures. It's Roach Smith who deserves particular attention. As secretary, he established the organisation's organisational framework and, most importantly, organised the first 6 annual congresses. These congresses were at the heart of the BAA's mission. They were designed to bring together visiting experts with local antiquaries, and they consciously emulated the French Congrès Archéologique and the annual meetings of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. The first Congress, held in Canterbury in 1844, established a template that endured for decades, but it also generated a huge burden of labour. As Smith later wrote in his retrospections, the examination of large masses of correspondence relating to these congresses confirms my old conviction of the enormous amount of troublesome work they produced with very inadequate results. The labour fell upon a few, the enjoyment upon a many. This asymmetry, few workers, many beneficiaries, would be a defining feature of the Secretary's role throughout the 19th century. The story of the 1844 Canterbury Congress is well known. The tensions it exposed led directly to the formation of the Archaeological Institute. At the heart of that schism lay a contest over class, authority, and the perceived propriety of antiquarian conduct. The Athenaeum, which championed the newly formed institute, notoriously declared, "The traders must go," and mocked what it called the Canterbury Cockneyisms of the British Archaeological Association, thinly veiled attacks on the social status of Roach Smith and Wright. According to the Athenaeum, the association required secretaries who were, I quote, "disinterested men of name and standing, who can write good English and speak it when it is written." This rhetoric reveals how the office of secretary served as a flashpoint for anxieties about professionalism, class, and intellectual authority. What the Athenaeum labelled self-promotion, we might now more accurately describe as early attempts at professionalisation, in a field only beginning to formalise its scholarly standards. An immediate result of the schism was the departure of Albert Way, and the addition of new BAA secretaries. Smith, on the screen, remained a key figure, but he was joined by Thomas Crofton Croker, an Irish antiquary and admiralty clerk. If he looks slightly out of proportion there, it's because he was only 4 foot something. Thomas Wright, who is now redefined as a secretary for foreign correspondence, and Captain A.B. Beecher, appointed the hydrographical secretary, whose role is never described and of whom I've been unable to locate a portrait. Their presence indicates how the title secretary was used to institutionalise a wide variety of intellectual and administrative tasks, not all clearly defined. So who were these secretaries? Looking across the 19th century, several characteristics emerge about the BAA secretaries. The suggestion, voiced by the Athenaeum, that the role offered the opportunity for advancement was echoed by one of the holders of the role, James Robinson Planchet. I won't read the quotation, but you can see that it suggests that there was an advantage in being a secretary. If nothing else, it got you turtle soup. I don't think we're having any of that today. They were occupationally diverse. Amongst the early secretaries, we find a huge occupational diversity, even within a single individual. These men seem to embody what we might now call a portfolio career. Most spectacular in this regard is J.R. Planchet, who was a playwright, theatrical impresario, herald, and expert in armour, who curated exhibitions at the Manchester Treasures Exhibition and at the Tower of London. Such diversity complicates any simple divide between amateur and professional. Many secretaries used antiquarian work to supplement their income or their reputation. Others brought professional skills into antiquarian concerns. It's perhaps notable, however, that only 2 of the secretaries were Anglican clergymen. There were suggestions that the 1844 schism had developed along Tractarian versus anti-Tractarian lines, and more research may reveal that Low Church, even non-conformist beliefs, were dominant within the BAA. Association with the Church of England encouraged an architectural focus for the early Archaeological Institute. But after 1850, there seems to have been a recognition that the association needed more architectural expertise, and several of the secretaries, including those I've got on the screen, were architects. In the 1840s too, the secessionists and key members were so closely associated with the British Museum. But this began to shift with the appointment of Edward Levian, an assistant in the manuscripts department at the British Museum, who served alongside architect Edward Roberts as secretary, and was soon followed by Walter de Grey Birch, another manuscripts curator at the British Museum, who partnered with architect Loftus Brock. So this seems to be a pattern, architect and manuscript specialist working together as 2 secretaries. There were always 2 secretaries during the 19th century. Some, like Roach Smith and Edward Sire Cuming, who was ex-secretary from the 1850s, were avid collectors whose activities shaped the material culture of later museums. Smith's immense London assemblage, later purchased by the British Museum, and Cuming's collection, now central to the Southwark Heritage Centre, demonstrate how secretarial roles intersected with excavations, markets and networks of exchange. The significance of the BAA at the heart of the febrile world of 19th century collecting is demonstrated by Cuming's use of the BAA meeting of the 28th of April 1858 to expose what he had identified as the fraudulent activities of Billy Smith and Charlie Eaton, creators of the so-called Shadwell forgeries, pilgrims' badges, seals and other small items said to have been picked up on the shore of the Thames, but actually created by Billy and Charlie, giving them their other names of Billies and Charlies. Given the subsequent controversy, it's no surprise that no mention at all is made of his paper in the pages of the BAA journal, but it was reported in the Athenaeum, and the Athenaeum was subsequently sued for libel by George Eastwood, the main dealer in such items. This could have been an awkward moment for the BAA. As the subsequent libel case, Charles Roach Smith was called as an expert witness to the authenticity of the objects. He said they were so bad that nobody would have created them that badly. As was the former secretary Thomas Hugo, who felt that they were authentic but couldn't point to any evidence for his feeling. And also former draftsman Frederick Fairholt. Undeterred, Cuming went on to present 2 further papers which are reported on other forged items, but these didn't generate a libel case and therefore are much less famous. Most of the secretaries published extensively in the journal of the BAA, as well as elsewhere, and without their contributions, the periodical would have been significantly thinner. Several also had paid antiquarian sidelines. Thomas Wright earned fees for secretarial posts across various societies, and Pettigrew had catalogued the Duke of Sussex library. The early secretaries belonged to an extraordinary array of other societies: the Society of Antiquaries, the Numismatic Society, the Royal Society of Literature, the Linnaean Society, the Entomological Society, and a host of literary, scientific and local antiquarian groups. The secretary thus served as a node, a mechanism for channeling social capital, intellectual resources, and institutional legitimacy. There were, however, varying opinions amongst the secretaries on whom should be cultivated, whether the association benefited more from connections with the great and the good, or whether a smaller body of active practitioners would be more valuable to its ends. This and other disagreements meant that the office of secretary was not only central, but also volatile. As this infographic shows, they tended to serve and resign in batches. 2 crises illustrate this. By 1850, Charles Roach Smith was exhausted and overextended. He reported to his friend, Vorsey, his intention to resign from his role as secretary because the duties had become, I quote, too oppressive to my slender pecuniary resources. And when the president, Lord Albert Conyngham, proposed a testimonial to Smith on his retirement, the committee refused. I haven't yet been able to find out what their grounds for refusal were. Conyngham resigned, followed by Croker and Wright, so Pettigrew alone remained from the original leadership. He had always served as treasurer, but his role as treasurer very often overlapped with duties that we might think of as the secretary's duties, so in a way he should be considered as a 4th secretary. At this moment, J.R. Planchet stepped in, stabilising the association. But because he spent much time outside London, a 3rd secretary, the Reverend Thomas Hugo, was appointed to take over correspondence in his absence. This proliferation of secretaries reflects the sheer administrative pressure of fortnightly meetings, Congress preparation, and constant incoming correspondence. The Chepstow Congress of 1854 triggered the next crisis. At the Roman town of Carwent, members saw an opportunity for the association's first official excavation. Pettigrew secured permission from the landowner, but local antiquaries, who were members of the newly formed Caerleon Antiquarian Association, felt preempted. They had had their eyes on this site for a long while. Pettigrew and others accused Hugo of encouraging this local resistance and of sending letters that personally attacked Pettigrew. Matters escalated when two competing meeting notices were issued, one by Pettigrew, one by Hugo and fellow Secretary Bailey, each summoning council to a different location at the same time. The dispute spilled into the public press. Hugo eventually claimed that he had acted in a private capacity, not as secretary to the BAA, but the remaining officers refused to work with him. And in December 1855, he was ejected, and this is the meeting note of the people who had called the extraordinary general meeting that ejected him. Sire Cuming replaced him, and his friend Bailey also left the association. The position of third secretary was at that point abolished. These episodes show that the BAA Secretariat was not merely clerical, it was political, mediating disputes over authority, legitimacy, and the interpretation of antiquarian etiquette. So what did the secretaries actually do? According to the 1846 AGM, which is really the first constitution, the BAA hadn't had a constitution until this time, which was one of the problems in 1844. So according to this, the secretaries were to attend meetings, send notices, read letters and papers, and communicate with foreign societies. But in practice, these duties expanded far beyond such minimal descriptions. The BAA's fortnightly meetings were information dense. They included letters from regional members, presentations of small finds, manuscript transcriptions, and discussions of local antiquities, in which the secretaries always took a leading role. They had to read the letters, they often gave their own papers, they commented on anything that was found, and they curated which communications were read when there were too many. Having been ejected from the rooms of the Numismatic Society, where the society had originally met, the association struggled to find a stable address. In 1855, Pettigrew stated that meetings had always been held in his own house on Savile Row. But the need for something more official was clearly felt, and as early as 1844, Planchet was negotiating with the publisher, Henry George Bone, who offered premises on York Street in Covent Garden. As Planchet wrote, the situation is undeniable, close to the antiquaries and nearer for Smith and Barham, and not too far for the West Enders. Bone's huge collection of antiquarian publications would be available to the committee and at arm's reach. And most importantly, there would be a brass plate on the door, a continual advertisement to the host of antiquaries and literary men who are continually at Bone's, etc., etc., etc. This was an important step in the association's search for institutional legitimacy and was proudly presented on the title page of the journal. However, in 1852, Bone ceased to publish the journal, and in the Post Office directory of that year, the address is given as 32 Sackville Street, next to Pettigrew's house, and placing the BAA in a dense ecosystem of 19th century benevolent and literary societies which shared the building. They all seem to have had leasehold interest in it and held their meetings there. The association also accumulated books, drawings and objects. To manage these, the office of registrar, later known as the curator and librarian, was created. By the 1880s, the library had moved to the offices of the second secretary, the architect E.P. Loftus-Brock, who worked near the British Museum, reflecting both spatial constraints and the close intertwining of personal and institutional resources. The Library Committee was appointed to try and deal with the problem of the library, but they never succeeded enabling the books to become a benefit for ordinary members, and it never became a lending library, much as everybody wanted it to be that. They never succeeded. Before the 1870s, the BAA had no formally designated editor. Wright, Pettigrew and others filled the role informally. Initially, there was an editorial committee whose members were each intended to take responsibility for their specialist area. And it was a move to eject Thomas Wright from this committee that became the catalyst for the 1844 split. And it's unclear whether such a committee was ever reconvened. From 1875, Walter de Grey Birch became the de facto professional editor, and he was responsible for creating the first comprehensive index of the journal up to the time when he took over. After Birch, H.J. Duckinfield Astley served as the editorial secretary, marking the moment when editorial work became formally institutionalised. Before photography became widely available, the association had to employ official draftsmen. There's pictures here of two of them, F.W. Fairholt. Then there was a chap called Prejean, then a chap called Tenniswood, and then the final one, Worthington G. Smith, who's there with his lovely dog. And also paleographers, Black, Hopper, Birch, and Birch's boss at the British Museum, Maund Thompson. And their work ensured that manuscripts, inscriptions, seals, and small finds could be shared with the membership through the journal. The need to publish manuscripts and archival material, which now rather lies outside the interests of the BAA, reflected the importance of publishing sources in the days before the establishment of a network of a public archive repository in the 20th century. And it's clear that the BAA played a very important role in locating and demonstrating the significance of such materials. For example, in February 1874, a Mr. Watling from Suffolk wrote to the BAA, having visited the church in Mendlesham, where he'd found, in the upper room of the porch, a collection of armour and a mass of documents in old chests. His concern was that these neglected documents and armour would disappear. Sire Cuming read Watling's letter to the meeting and said something must be done. Within a month, Sir Thomas Hardy of the Historic Manuscripts Commission read the report in the BAA's proceedings of February and wrote to the association to say that it was because of their report that he would send someone to Mendlesham. And in 1876, the Mendlesham Archive was published in the 5th report of the Historic Manuscripts Commission. Unfortunately, although the BAA's action probably helped save both the armour and the archive, some documents did disappear before the rest were eventually transferred to the newly established Muniment Room in Ipswich in 1949. So all these roles, I think, reveal how secretarial work blended scholarship, administration, and sometimes diplomacy. The early secretaries were very far from neutral administrators. They shaped the journal through their editorial preferences. They shaped congresses through their organisational choices, and they shaped antiquarian discourse by selecting communications. And they shaped the association's reputation through their networking. But perhaps the most striking aspect of their work is the sociable dimension. In his testimonial address upon retirement, Walter de Grey Birch described what he valued most. Not simply the volumes of the journal that he'd edited, nor even the knowledge that he had acquired, but the community the congresses fostered. He spoke of the meetings as enabling that sweet converse of soul, which goes to make human life a foretaste of the life to come. And in this remark, we glimpse what John McNeill understood so well, that antiquarian scholarship depends not only on written research, but on conviviality, generosity, and the cultivation of intellectual friendship. What then can we learn from this history? First, the 19th century secretaries reveal the BAA as an institution built on informal labour, personal networks, and the scholarly contributions of individuals who occupied complex social positions. Secondly, they show that the secretary has always been far more than a clerk. We don't even know who took the minutes because sadly the early minute books are all missing. The role blended organiser, editor, collector, ambassador, fundraiser, critic, and sometimes peacekeeper. Third, the history reminds us that the association's intellectual vitality has always depended on people who can build connections between scholars and amateurs, between local antiquaries and national institutions, between collections and publications, and across generations. And in that sense, the long genealogy of the BAA secretaries culminates in many ways in John McNeill. Like the very best of his predecessors, John combined administrative skill with intellectual generosity. Like them, he built networks. But unlike the 19th century figures, he did so in a professionalised landscape, while preserving the older values of sociability and delight in shared knowledge. And as we consider how to reshape the role of the secretary within the modern association, the 19th century suggests that the essential quality is not bureaucratic efficiency, but the ability to generate community, to nurture scholarship, and to sustain the sociable bonds that give antiquarian work its distinctive richness. Thank you. There you go.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much indeed, Alex, for that contribution, which helps to contextualize the most important role and generative role within the BAA, but one that hasn't always received as much recognition as perhaps it should. But of course, with John in the role, it did. And we now have another past, I think the anti-penultimate president of the BAA. I'm not quite sure I'm right about that. Richard Halsey. And Richard is going to speak to us about capitals, local capitals at St. Fried's, now Oxford Cathedral. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, good. In 1988, I published an article in the local journal Oxoniensia about the 12th century church of St. Fried's Priory. And there's a comment there that says, there will be a further article about the capitals. Every now and then, John would sort of say, how's it coming on? And I very much regret to say that this is it. Understanding non-Cistercian ecclesiastical architecture in the generation before Canterbury is stymied by the lack of complete buildings and in particular the Royal Abbey of Faversham, begun by King Stephen in 1148. The Temple Church in London, complete by 1161, is one survivor, but it has suffered two thoroughgoing restorations, and a second is the Church of the Hospital of St. Cross in Winchester, the chancel probably finished by the 1171 date of its founder, King Stephen's brother, Henry of Blois. The Church of St. Fried's Augustinian Priory, since 1546, Oxford Cathedral, is the third roofed survivor. Its capitals have attracted attention since being included in John Carter's Ancient Architecture of England, and then given a whole plate in John Britton's account. But it was Nicholas Pevsner, in his 1974 edition of the Buildings of England Oxfordshire volume, who wrote, "The capitals of Oxford Cathedral are of great variety and few are run-of-the-mill. As we have no dates, and as crockets appear everywhere and waterleaf rarely, and as waterleaf was popular to about 1190 and crockets after 1190, the usually accepted dating to the last quarter of the 12th century of the whole building seems too early, and something like 1190 to 1210 more probable." In his 2023 revision, Simon Bradley abandoned that flawed stylistic dating and wrote, "The major capitals continue with exceptional variety and few are run-of-the-mill. Crockets appear everywhere, waterleaf more rarely." And then Bradley adopts the widely agreed 1160 to 70 start date for the eastern arm, with the nave post 1180. Pevsner must have known Lawrence Stone's assessment in his 1955 Pelican History of Art volume, where he describes how coeval with the fully developed French crockets at Canterbury, the capitals of the presbytery of Oxford Cathedral show English sculptors making their own individual experiments in new forms, which show a remarkable variety of emergent stiff-leaf trefoils, waterleaf and crockets, the latter clearly influenced by William of Sens' work at Canterbury. Stone thought the presbytery was erected for the translation of St. Fried's on the February 12th, 1180, a well-recorded event attended by the Archbishop of Canterbury and many other high-ranking ecclesiastics. This indicates the chancel and perhaps north transept chapel that most likely housed the shrine were complete. So the suggested starting date of the 1160s. I think the sculptural influence from the Canterbury choir only starts in the second post-translation campaign, where two easternmost nave capitals imitate Canterbury capitals erected in 1178-79, and the nave arcades have alternating round and octagonal columns. I'll show you the capitals later. There are numerous fabric details indicating that the chancel was built from the east to adjoin a previous church on the axis of the present transepts and chapter house, probably the stone church built after a destructive fire in 1002. I disagree with John Blair's idea up here about the site of that church. I think it is under the present nave. The chapter house front is the earliest visible fabric, no earlier than about 1140, when charter evidence suggests the canons were seeking permission to extend their precinct beyond the existing city wall. That chapter house doorway and the associated cloister, now only known from a few fragments, stylistically follow Reading Abbey work, particularly in the use of beakheads and cat masks within three-stranded interlaced capitals. Those beakheads are now in the Museum of Oxford collection. The 1160s choir has noticeably less Romanesque detail than the chapter house, even if the giant order elevation is the last in a line starting with Tewkesbury around 1090. The 20 large half capitals fall into four main types, all with a prominent bell rim below the abacus. Four are decorated with a tubular vine scroll with a few leaves, an occasional bunch of grapes, and some prominent corner crockets. I should say here that many of these chancel crockets actually have a spiral or shell form rather than any leaves, so they're actually closer to a classical volute. But for simplicity, I will call all the lumps at the corners crockets. Four capitals have some feathery upright leaves rising from the necking in front of plantain leaves, again with prominent crockets. The third group is strikingly sparse, but retains again the prominent crockets. The feathery leaves are omitted, leaving the plantain leaves just visible against the prominent bell rim background. And a subset of four of these are four really minimalist at the lowest level in the aisles. They even omit the plantain leaf, leaving just simple leaf spikes rising to the corners, normally without crockets. And then the fourth and smallest group I've called the coronet form, as there is a ring of frilly palmette leaves above the necking, but still with corner crockets. The use of a prominent bell rim and big corner classicizing crockets suggest a northern French source, but clearly independent of the post-1175 work at Canterbury Cathedral. The two cathedrals at Noyon and Senlis are begun after Saint-Denis, but before Oxford, and they continue building into the 1180s. Both show the progressive breakdown of a Corinthian capital and the use of its components to invent new capital designs. Christopher Wilson has demonstrated the importance of these and other churches north and northwest of Paris to the introduction of Gothic architecture to England at the Temple Church in London, finished just as Oxford is starting, and of course at the roughly contemporary church of St. Cross in Winchester. He doesn't mention Oxford, though in a previous article on the Worcester West Bays, he thought some of the Oxford capitals have a strongly French flavour. The Temple Church capitals on the blind arcading around the circular nave have been renewed twice, in 1827 and in 1947, with each architect at the time claiming to be simply renewing what they had found. Billings' engravings of 1838 do at least show the basic designs after the first renewal, and there is much in common with Oxford. The use of a bell rim below the abacus, simple pointed leaves rising to the corner, some crisscross, even a couple of coronets. There are few proper crockets, just one multi-scallop and no pure Corinthian capital. The temple spandrel heads are without precedent, but the occasional use of profile and angled heads has a corollary in the choir aisles at Oxford. The simplicity of some capitals at the temple might derive from the Purbeck capital of the main arcade and vault responds, just as the Purbeck marblers at Henry of Blois' Wolsey Palace took their cue from the Tournai capitals he brought there. And is it possible that this sort of simplicity was present in the lavish use of Purbeck at Faversham? Only the choir of Henry of Blois' Hospital of St. Cross is thought to have been completed by his death in 1171. Like Oxford, it is a fully rib-vaulted church of the second rank with a three-storey elevation, but with elaborate sculptural decoration. This has a Romanesque richness with much variety in the use of foliage, including some analogous to the minor capitals of Oxford's choir. The original large columnar choir piers of St. Cross were apparently of Purbeck and were larger versions of the support for the Tournai font in the cathedral. And again, were these sort of things the predecessors of the sparse choir capitals at Oxford? But what is not seen at the Temple or Winchester are capitals with tubular vines. The Oxford examples are heavily undercut, more like metalwork than stone, the clipped tubes emerging from thick stems on the necking with few leaves. One capital has some grapes, another a mask, and most unusually, small heads support the crockets of a third. That's a crocket which isn't a crocket. Despite vines having been used extensively on large capitals earlier in the 12th century, like those, the nave at Saint-Geneviève in Paris and the choir capitals at Le Mans, such decoration becomes rare across northern France after about 1140. Large early 12th century columns in England are not sculpted, though they may well have had painted vine scrolls. As the century progressed, cubic and multi-scallop elements were used. It is presumably the latter that Pevsner thinks as being run-of-the-mill, such as the mid-century Malmesbury nave piers, for instance. I've only found one large mid-12th century capital with decoration anything like that at Oxford, in the undercroft of the East Range of Westminster Abbey. It is damaged, but recent conservation suggests there were big heads rather than volutes at the corners, and an overall vine scroll, not unlike that at Oxford, but perhaps better organised. And what was the origin of these capitals? Manuscripts, glass, precious metalwork and ivories regularly used these sort of tubular vines for borders and backgrounds, and it is occasionally seen in sculpture, like the mid-century south door at Malmesbury Abbey. You can see it in the top order there. But such scrollwork is usually beaded or stranded, just like this Provenance capital now in Winchester Museum. So can the Oxford capitals be seen as a development, or rather refinement, into tubes of the stranded scrollwork of Reading Abbey Cloister and the Chapter House at Oxford? Reading is 27 miles southwest of Oxford, as any of you who come on the train will know. And the plan of its choir, which was finished enough for Henry to be buried in it in 1136, was an almost exact copy of Tewkesbury, so it could well have had a giant order elevation. And were those big Reading capitals decorated with tubular vines like those at Oxford a generation later? Nothing has yet been discovered at Reading to suggest this is a possibility. But as the post-1140 Oxford cloister has Reading-style sculpture, are these big four Oxford choir capitals with tubular vines just enlarged versions of what was in the cloister? Progression from small to large scale is seen in a few minor capitals in the choir aisles, where the respond capitals are smaller versions of the arcade capitals, with a bell rim, corner crockets, and similar leaf types. But the pseudo-triforium arcades on the main elevation display quite different capital designs, none with vines, most with elaborate foliage, but very few examples of simple pointed leaves. My coronet type does occur, as do the strongly ribbed crispy leaves that you see at St. Cross. And it is these designs, and not the main arcade capitals, that are repeated and developed on the many capitals of the crossing piers, probably of the post-1180 second campaign. These, in turn, inspire the big capitals of the North Transept. The bell rim disappears, the corners have converging leaves, but there are no real crockets. Rows of upright five-lobed leaves, which are not quite stiff leaf, and waterleaf capitals appear side by side. And these are the capitals that confuse Pevsner by being all together and not in consecutive building phases either side of 1190. The small capitals of the North and South Transept clerestories continue to demonstrate lively variations on themes established in that choir pseudo-triforium. The nave elevation continues the giant order of the transepts, but with a solid triforium opening and with lots of keeled mouldings. But the columns start to alternate between octagon and round, and the first pair have capitals unlike others. They're large fleshy crockets, exaggerated imitations of capitals, erected 1178, 1179 in William of Sens's choir at Canterbury. Oddly, they do not use a bell rim, and their leaves are a raised central stem, more akin to what we term stiff leaf, unlike that five-lobed leaf used in the transept, which actually has a channel rather than a rib. The plainer water leaf and spade leaf types of the north transept continue into the nave, and one lower capital in the north nave aisle returns to the sparest choir design, but with elaborate feathers rather than spikes. A new design that transfers the Canterbury work into something rather more linear appears further into the nave, the leafy terminals even invading the abacus. The quality of carving has declined, and towards the end, West End, it gets even poorer, suggesting that neither money nor decent carvers were available. The nave clerestory capitals, indeed, become pretty minimal. The invention shown by those big capital carvers of the chancel is long gone, and except for the two inspired by Canterbury, the large nave and transept capitals are being carved by small-scale carvers, adapting their designs more or less successfully to cover these bigger fields. Well, that's the art historical story, using sculpture to help determine the sequencing and relative dates of the fabric. But were the patron and his master mason trying to convey something in their choice of elevation and capital sculpture? There are two priors in this period, Master Robert of Cricklade, 1141 to 74, and Prior Philip, 1175 to 91. So the former is the likely patron of this new East End, and the decline perhaps sets in after the impetus goes once Philip dies and there's a gap. Robert had been a canon at Cirencester, or big Augustinian priory, whose large aisled church was dedicated in 1176, just after he'd left, really, and of which we know little more than the plan. John Blair tells us that Robert was a notable scholar and moved in circles interested in artistic patronage, who almost certainly wrote a life of St. Fride's-Wide. Later, he wrote one of the earliest accounts of the life and miracles of Thomas Becket, 1173-4, following his own cure at the shrine. He went to Rome at least twice, once via Sicily, and he studied in Paris a number of times, writing critiques of the Parisian master's work. He also spent time in Scotland in the early 1160s, so he was a well-travelled and well-educated Augustinian master. Peter Kidson liked to think that the giant order came about at Oxford because Robert had read Vitruvius. But the most obvious equation to take from Vitruvius is to make the column height 10 times its diameter. But at St. Fried's it is just 6 times. And although there is a clear use of root 2 relationships to determine levels, nothing in the Oxford elevation corresponds with Vitruvian figures. I suggest the giant order at Oxford apes its use at Reading Abbey, and the vine scroll capital designs came with it, or evolved within the Oxford workshop after the cloister. But Robert surely encountered the emerging early Gothic style in northeast France on his continental trips. In Paris alone, Saint-Martin-des-Champs, Saint-Denis and Notre Dame were being built when he was there. Did he like what he saw and notice how different and new it was to what was happening in his own church and engage a French mason? Working in the Conway Library sometime in the 1970s, I was engaged in conversation about these capitals by Jean Berny. And when I asked him if he thought they were by a French or English mason, he was certain that they were an Englishman's take on Northern French Gothic. And who am I to disagree? Can we conclude then that Robert was associating himself with the developing architecture of northern France and Paris that we now call French Early Gothic? Although perhaps already visible in the London Temple just as Oxford gets going and perhaps elsewhere, was Robert wanting to escape from long-established English architecture, which the tubular vine capitals represented? If so, why persevere with the giant order elevation? Perhaps Robert's change of direction came too late to change the fundamental design without great expense, or perhaps it was enough to just change the capital style. My ideas are very speculative, but use of the giant order and tubular vine capitals has a distinctly different character to the rest of the choir, where interest in Northern French Gothic is clear. Robert's successor, Prior Philip, was responsible for translating St. Fried's bones from her grave into a reliquary, and he also wrote up her miracles to promote the cult. Quite how much had been complete or set out by the 1180 translation is unclear, but the capital designs of the transepts, crossing and nave are by the same workshop which has its beginnings in the minor capitals of the choir triforium, and it's not that of the big, non-tubular vine, French-inspired choir capitals. We would be a bit wiser if only Robert had written up what he encountered on his continental trips. But I suspect he might be quite pleased that 700 years later, his capitals were not considered by a 20th century master as run-of-the-mill. Thank you.
Are you able to do this? Lloyd's going to try and do his own. Very good. Thank you very much, Richard. I'm sure that'll provoke a lot of questions. Our next speaker is Lloyd de Beer, and Lloyd was, until recently, the director of the British Archaeological Association, and invited a lot of interesting speakers to come and talk at the association, and did various other work. He's talking to us today about something that he's been interested in for a very long time. Lloyd.
Right, can everyone hear me at the back? I'll try and speak up. Thank you very much, Julian. Thanks to all the organisers. It's a fitting tribute to John, who we all miss dearly. So my paper today will explore the chapel of Our Lady of the Undercroft at Canterbury Cathedral. Surprisingly, the chapel has so far escaped modern scholarly attention, despite the fact that it housed a significant cult image, was the focus of sustained royal patronage and pilgrimage, and even, as we will see, received a request for royal burial. So what I'm presenting today is the sketch of an idea and a series of questions, which I hope you might help me answer. As Julian said, I've been interested in this building for a long time and visited many times and have a folder on my computer where I throw lots of images and ideas in, and then came to write this, and I thought, actually, what have I gathered, So I need a little bit of help in thinking it through. My focus is the 14th century remodeling of the Undercroft Chapel that you see on screen. Why was this done? My argument is that the goal was to enhance the Solomonic characteristics of the architecture and thus situate an enthroned image of Mary as Solomon in the crypt. If this idea is acceptable to you all, I would like to end my paper today with a question of what this means about Solomonic iconography more broadly in 14th century England. What I'm not going to do today is to try and define the date of the building. There's been no serious attempt to situate it with a specific patron, nor the architecture within a stylistic trajectory. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to broadly assign this 1350 to 1390 date, which I know is not ideal, and I'm sure there's many here who can help in refining it. So let's begin then with the chapel. Since the late 11th century, a chapel and an altar dedicated to Our Lady has been located in its present site in the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral. As you can see from the floor plan on screen, the chapel occupies the final 2 bays of the crypt's central area and is surrounded by 12 massive Romanesque piers. Canterbury's crypt is distinguished by the sublime quality of its sculpture, particularly here in the central area, where the column shafts are highly inventive, moving from carved geometric decoration to unworked plain stone piers in repetition. The same can be said for the column capitals, which are famous for their variety. Visually, the chapel is the culmination of this scheme, situated at the end of a run of imaginative sculptural play, set between a pair of spiral columns at the east end. You can't really see that, but spiral columns there, plain piers in the middle, and then spiral columns there. Before the grand 12th century transformation of the crypt's far eastern end, after Becket's death, this chapel must have been a central focus of the entire space in the crypt, and its dedication to the Virgin Mary marked it as among the most significant altars in the cathedral. It is, after all, located directly below the high altar above. What exactly the chapel looked like prior to its Gothic remodeling is difficult to ascertain. It appears, however, that instead of being completely open, there were stone partitions dividing the space. When restoration work was done on the floor of the chapel in the 1890s, a Romanesque structure was discovered underneath the later screenwork in the western bay, which is why these sharp grooves were left in so that we can still see it. Admittedly, this is rather hard to make out today. Nevertheless, this suggests that the Gothic screen that we'll discuss shortly made use of the Romanesque chapel's form, at least partially, in terms of marking out its general shape. So let us look then at the Gothic intervention and how it interacts with the earlier phase. First, as already noted, the Romanesque columns were retained, these being 4 spiral columns at the east and the west, as I've said, and plain piers in the middle. These plain piers were painted at the time of remodeling so that they too were made to look spiral in design. And just in case you thought this was a later alteration, so here's the painted spiral columns. This is recorded in this early 18th century print of Lady Moon's tomb where, I mean, they're represented kind of sculpturally. There's her head there, and there's those columns. And this abuts the southern side of the eastern bay, suggesting that the paintwork we see today is ancient. Her tomb, which was clearly inserted into the chapel at post-construction date, also provides a kind of terminus antiquem for the structure. Although the Romanesque columns were saved and reused, the capitals did not fare so well. They were cut away or recarved, replaced with simple octagonal fluted capitals, the tops of which were less plain at the west end, but are crenellated at the center. So there you've got the plain capital. There's at the east end crenellated and then crenellated at the center. And these new capitals were smaller in height than the Romanesque ones, and so where the lowest section of the Gothic work connects to the Romanesque shaft, it was also painted there. So they kind of extended up the carved work in painted form to preserve the spiral design. Today, the entire western front of the chapel is open to the crypt and lacks any structural work as far as I can see. But given the western bay can be entered via a door at the north and the south, so there's a door there and there's a door there, it seems unlikely it was always so accessible from the front. The earliest description of the chapel from 1536 comes to us from Erasmus, who describes it in his Pilgrimage of Pure Devotion, calling the space doubly railed in and encompassed about with iron bars. This doesn't help us determine what exactly this western front looked like, but it's suggestive of masses of ironwork, which is now lost. We know that the iron grills connecting the 12 external piers were installed in 1377-78 when John of Otford was warden of St. Mary's altar. And I'm showing you on screen, this is a mocked-up drawing that Tim Tatton Brown sent me, where he's kind of drawn in where the external ironwork was located. And I'm just showing on screen here a section of the stonework that was cut away that you can find in all of these points going around. And I'm really grateful to Tim for sharing his thoughts so freely on this chapel. The Gothic screenwork in both bays of the chapel is light and airy, and in its proportions has the feel of micro-architecture. In the western bay, we move from a plain base level to a series of 3 pierced openings either side of the door, and each of them is made up of this very interesting design where you have an ogee that doesn't touch but transforms into a trefoil. This feels very idiosyncratic, and there must be another example of this or a connection somewhere else. And hopefully someone here might have come across it. I was looking for John Goodall, who I imagine might have come across something like this. Above the lower level in the doors are canopies composed of recessed and stepped 4 light and 2 light openings topped with quatrefoils surmounted by a delicate row of single lancets. Here in the western bay, the screens are molded on both the outside and the inside of the chapel, so you can see it when you go through the door and on the inside. This is not the case for the eastern bay, where the exterior of the structure is unmolded. Its decoration can only be seen from inside the chapel. The outside is rough and ready with various holes and fixings, so it's completely covered. There's something going on here. I don't exactly know what. Originally, the chapel's 2 bays were separated by a low stone sill and an iron grille. The sill, parts of which were still extant or at least described in the late 19th century, is now gone, but the fixings for the ironwork can still be seen in the arch that separates the 2 bays. So this is where it's presumed that the ironwork was fixed. Like the western bay, the eastern side can be accessed via doors at the north and the south. The entrance and the screenwork on the north side is canted rather than flush, and perhaps here, like elsewhere, the Gothic structure followed the Romanesque precedent. So I'm just speaking to that part of the building there. One major difference between the western and the eastern bays is the introduction of crenellation on the capitals, as I've already pointed out, but continuing along the string course. This signifies a change in tone for the different spaces from an earthly to a more heavenly realm, the closer to the altar that you get. Was the intention here allegorical? Are we supposed to view this as moralizing in some way? And I show on the right the image of the Tower of Wisdom from the Delisle Psalter, a contemporary image showing how architecture could act as a vehicle for thinking, a diagram for memory. So here we have doors as patience, crenellation as purity, charity, and so on. This kind of thing has obviously been worked on quite a lot by Mary Carruthers, Sandy Heslop, Paul Binsky, many others. The altar reredos is truly magnificent. It is comprised of a series of architecturally complex image niches, with the largest at the center, for the image of the Virgin Mary. The original image, which no longer survives, was situated on a sculpted base with a narrative cycle. This is hard to make out. This is the central part here. And I've looked at this quite closely and had convinced myself at one point I could see Solomon and Sheba. I can kind of see 2 figures, but I think this could also potentially be the coronation of the Virgin or, you know, anything else. You see what you want to see, you know. So this sculpted base was supported on a triple column that no longer survives, except for its fragmentary capital that might have stood proud of the actual base of the reredos. The central niche and the canopy above projects from the reredos and is made up of a series of slender triple columns, each of which is painted with spiral designs in red and gold So these are what I'm talking about here, these very tall, thin columns, each of which is painted with a spiral design. And above the canopy is a curious lantern structure rising out of the top, which comes complete with diminutive flying buttresses. I'm not making a kind of comparison here, except to say that other than, say, Ely Octagon, I haven't really come across a lantern structure like this at this date, except on microarchitecture, which I'll get to a little bit later on. I'm sure I can be corrected. To the immediate left and right of the Virgin, there is room for 4 smaller images and then 3 larger images either side of those. There are little pedestals with holes in which the base of a carved or metal image could be set. The reverse of the reredos, like the rest of the eastern bay, is unworked, but it's more deeply recessed in the areas immediately behind the niches. So this is quite deep, this recession behind it. And I've wondered, looking very closely at surviving ironwork. So there's this hinge that is located here. I'm covering it here with this image, but just here. And I wondered slightly what actually was based around the back of this and whether potentially this part of the reredos was actually glazed in some way. There's a lot of surviving ironwork in the ambulatory just behind the chapel for these large iron rings that potentially lanterns could have been hung from. And potentially this points towards additional lighting. Given the darkness of the crypt and the use of candle for light, the effect could have been quite extraordinary, one of intense darkness and focused flickering light. That leaves the question of what the image at the center actually looked like. A smaller object might provide some clues. Brian Spencer argued that a remarkable group of pilgrim souvenirs were made for the Undercroft Chapel. We see on this badge a seated Virgin and Child in a micro-architectural niche between 2 saints, a king and Archbishop Thomas Becket, each of them standing on or behind lions. So the lions are just there to the base. Now, I'm not aware of any images where a king or Becket stands on a lion. Again, very happy to be corrected, so I'm also prepared to see these as lions that sit either side of the throne of Mary and Christ. The Virgin here is particularly regal. She's enthroned, she's wearing a crown, she's carrying a scepter. She's clearly shown as the Queen of Heaven, and Christ is shown leaping from her lap, standing tall and reaching towards to touch her fabulous jeweled brooch. Look, I know it's not perfect to use a badge like this to imagine what the reredos image looked like, and we should of course be cautious, but it is all we have to go on. The quality of the surviving medieval paint and polychromy and the gilding, is outstanding. Much is now missing, but we know from antiquarian records that there were once musical angels on the vaults in the East End. In the Western Bay, there's a grid of squares filled in with stars, so that's the Western Bay. This was painted over, and the vaults were covered in a dazzling array of gilded stars with little mirrors set at the center. So this is what survives now, and if you go closely, you can see that there are surviving bits of the mirrors that were set into these stars. Again, the jewel-like interplay of paint, reflection, and light must have been otherworldly. We see this too on the canopy here. That was above the Virgin, which was entirely gilded, its vault set with raised Pastilia-like decoration, providing surface texture and contrast. The greatest surviving paintwork relates to a series of heraldic shields that you see here that are based to the left and the right on the vaults next to the reredos. Most of them are later in date than the suggested 14th century remodeling, but there are 2 surviving shields for the King of England and the Prince of Wales, which are contemporary with the architecture. The one for the Prince of Wales is very, very hard to see, and I'm showing the location of the King's Shield here on screen, which is positioned directly above the central image of the Virgin. Figuring out which king and Prince of Wales might help us securely date the architecture, but I suggest that we should probably see these shields as representing Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, who can also be associated as major patrons of Canterbury and specifically the Chapel of Our Lady Undercroft, to which we now turn. By the second half of the 13th century, I'll stick with this for a second. By the second half of the 13th century, offerings were being made at the chapel, recorded as Santa Maria in Cryptis. English royals were particularly devoted to the site. Aside from normal gifts of money, Edward I gave a valuable golden brooch each year, and in 1335, Edward III presented a wax candle weighing £5. An intriguing payment comes from the king's chaplain William de Kildesby, who gave 2 shillings to divers minstrels who made minstrelsy before the image of Our Lady in the vault. This is fascinating, this payment to musicians to play music in front of images. Another payment in 1369 from Edward III was for 2 gold nobles and another gold coin to Hannekin Fiddler for playing music in front of the Virgin. There was also a payment in 1361 from a man called Hugh Painter, who we know as Master Hugh of St Albans, the artist in charge of St Stephen's Chapel, Westminster. His will specifies money for a pilgrim to journey to Becket's shrine and Our Lady of the Undercroft. Not to stretch a reference too far, but might Hugh have been involved in the painting of the chapel? Royal devotion to the Undercroft Chapel reached its apex with Edward the Black Prince, the son of Edward III. He was devoted to Canterbury his entire life, and especially to the Trinity, as Sophie Kelly has pointed out. He was married to Joan of Kent, and so had a strong regional connection, and had already in the 1360s built this magnificent and equally understudied chantry chapel, a stone's throw away from Our Lady of the Undercroft, which comes with what might well be a portrait of his wife Joan and his heraldry emerging from a boss. And this chapel was built following papal dispensation for him to be able to marry his cousin Joan. Yet he hardly mentions the chantry chapel that he built in his will of 1376, which specifies extensive gifts to the Undercroft Chapel instead. And I must also say that in his 1376 will, he explicitly requests to be buried in front of the image of Our Lady of the Undercroft, in front of the image in the crypt. To this chapel he left 1 white vestment entirely decorated with a vine of blue, the frontal given to us by the Bishop of Exeter, that excellent gifter of royal gifts, depicting the Assumption of Our Lady, a tabernacle of the Assumption given by the same bishop, 2 large twisted silver candlesticks, 2 basins with our arms, a great gilt and enameled chalice with the arms of Warren, 2 cruets shaped like angels. The will also records that the prince had founded a chantry here at Our Lady of the Undercroft, with 2 chaplains at the chapel, to which he also gives his mass book and his breviary. As is well known, the prince's wishes were not observed, and he was buried next to Becket's shrine, where he remains today. So now to Solomon. Why do I think this chapel has anything to do with the king, a biblical king noted for his wisdom? First, I want to deal with the columns. Now, I don't want anyone to think that I'm suggesting that in the late 11th century, anyone thought that the use of these spiral columns was Solomonic. Eric Fernie has clearly argued against reading Romanesque spiral columns as Solomonic, and has shown that this is almost always a later medieval association. I'm just showing some other examples from Repton and York Minster. I don't think these have anything to do with Solomon. What immediately struck me when looking at the Undercroft Chapel was the fact that the Romanesque spiral columns were retained and the plain piers were painted spiral too. Clearly, there is a desire to emphasize spirality in the space. If we accept that the image of the Virgin and Child was, as depicted on the Pilgrim's badge, was enthroned, then she was shown here at Canterbury in a throne amongst spiral columns. This association of the Virgin with Solomon and spiral columns reached its apex in the 14th century. For instance, this painting by the Nuremberg master from the Städel, showing the coronation of the Virgin by Christ with spiral columns behind. And the banderols here are from the Song of Solomon, in this sense speaking to Mary as Christ's bride. This fascinating altar frontal from Bern is more explicit. I'm sorry, this is the best quality image I could get. It shows the Virgin Mary enthroned within a spiral niche, and a series of lions shown either side. So the lions on the steps and then up there near her throne. I want to point out here again Christ's pose, this reaching out to play with the brooch of his mother, who is crowned Queen of Heaven. And the fact that these figures are standing, or could almost be shown standing on the lions as well as behind them. On the badge from Our Lady of the Undercroft, Christ does the same thing too, reaches out to play with his mother's jewelry. I think this idea of the Christ child playing with the jewelry of the Virgin is kind of worth an article in its own right. I'm showing it here because I think that this playfulness, the way any child might reach out to play with the jewelry of their mother, is also to do with the role of gifts between lovers, which brooches often were, and here also signals Christ's betrothal to his mother as Queen of Heaven. On the burn frontal, the combination of spirals and lions are emphatically Solomonic, here referencing the throne of Solomon from Kings. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with the finest gold. There were 6 steps to the throne, and 12 lions stood there, and on one side and upon the other, upon the 6 steps. Moving on from the spiral columns, I want to briefly look at the format of the altar reredos. In his seminal article on the subject, The Throne of Solomon and St. Edward's Chair, Francis Wormold explored a number of key images of Solomon's throne, for instance that at Gurk Cathedral in Austria, which has one of the earliest intact wall paintings showing the typological arrangement of the Virgin as Solomon's throne. Again, sorry for the quality, and I'm not going to go into it, but here you have the Virgin and the lions either side and the steps leading up to her. Wormold was particularly interested in this manuscript illumination, this 13th century French manuscript that I show on screen, the Verge de Solace. This image shows the Virgin and Child in a crenellated micro-architectural structure, enthroned with lions playing on the steps below her. The figures to the left and the right of the Virgin are a combination of saints, prophets, and virtues. The image here is clearly allegorical and relates to the Annunciation and the Incarnation. As Wormold points out, much of the text is from the New Testament and relates to these specific events. Clearly, we are meant to interpret the enthroned image of the Virgin as Solomonic in this instance. When I first became interested in Our Lady of the Undercroft, I was struck by the visual similarities of the manuscript image and the reredos. Of course, as earlier, we see what we want to see, and with the reredos, we have a lot less to go on. But there are, I think, clear similarities worth pursuing. The Virgin sits at the center, at Canterbury, the Virgin sits at the center of a crenellated architectural structure with 4 images immediately surrounding her and 3 larger images either side. There are no steps, there are no lions, so that might be a problem. If we recall that the Undercroft badge shows a lion either side of the Virgin's throne, perhaps it's possible there were lions present here too. I'm not suggesting that the manuscript image Wormold discussed was the source of the chapel's architecture, but that both were drawing on a live and developing iconographical tradition for representing the Virgin Mary as Solomon's throne. In his article, Wormold concluded with a discussion of the seal of King Henry III of England, which he saw as Solomonic and part of the same 13th century development in the iconography of Solomon's throne. I too want to bring in a seal into the conclusion of my paper and end with a question about the relationship between architecture as iconography. In 1340 and 41, when Edward III first courted the arms of France and England, he had a series of new seals made. This is his old seal here, and this is his new seal that he has made circa 1341. For instance, on the obverse, the king is framed by a background of tall, thin, 2 light windows set between 2 shields of his new arms, with a complex vaulted micro-architectural throne and canopy with 2 large lions either side of him. The canopy work above Edward's head is topped by an octagonal or hexagonal buttress lantern tower. Edward remained interested in this image for his seal, which he went on to remake a large number of times. Edward had the most seals of any king of England, I think 8 in total, but again, also worth an article in its own right. He would slightly tweak certain elements, but always keeping the same general iconography. He would add knights in armor, so we see knights added here, and he would sometimes add saints, so we have the Virgin Mary and St. George, but always keeping retaining this micro-architectural structure as the throne. Some of you might be looking at this and seeing no similarities at all, but it's my contention that even without lines or spiral columns, it's possible that this particular micro-architectural design could project Solomonic authority, that the architecture is a key, if not the key, element. So where does that leave us? My question with which I began still stands. Was the chapel of Our Lady of the Undercroft remodeled in the 14th century to emphasize Mary as Solomon? I believe that the use of spiral columns, the particularities of the architectural decoration, that being the crenellation, the format of the altar reredos, all point towards this being true. Whether or not we can accept the badge of Our Lady of the Undercroft, ? As showing lions either side of the throne is a point to discuss further. but I think that even if there weren't lions, we can still read the space as Solomonic. This chapel was immensely high status, patronized by English royalty, especially by Edward III and the Black Prince, and even, as we have seen, requested as the site of the prince's burial. The formal relationship between the microarchitecture on Edward's seal does require further thought, but perhaps this connection, as well as the appearance of their arms in the chapel, suggests that there was a deeper relationship between them and the image of Our Lady of the Undercroft. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Lloyd. Our fourth and final speaker in this session is Barbara Franze. Barbara comes to us from the University of Lausanne, and she shared John's enthusiasm for Romanesque architecture and sculpture, and had the pleasure and privilege of knowing John in over the last decade. The title of her talk is The Mystère Paintings, Images, Power and Society under Charlemagne. You don't need to do something. You can just...
Located at the end of the Mystère Valley in Graubünden, St. John's Abbey, with its church and paintings, is an exceptional testimony to Carolingian thought, culture and craftsmanship, which explains why it has been listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1983. Although famous, these paintings remain little known. Few studies have really focused on the overall project and the intentions behind the commission, while the question of dating has sparked much debate without any proposal really gaining acceptance. These difficulties are partly due to the fragmentary state of the decoration. The disappearance of many scenes deprives art historians of valuable clues and creates irreversible gaps in our understanding of the program. As elsewhere, they also stem from the very nature of our discipline. Our task is to identify signs in works of art and interpret them. Yet any interpretation remains, by definition, debatable and subject of criticism. Art history must also guard against preconceptions and received ideas. Our work is not to demonstrate the validity of a pre-established hypothesis, but to construct and sometimes deconstruct propositions until they form a solid edifice of knowledge, like stones assembled together. John McNeill always worked like a good bricklayer, without prejudice, without abusing his authority, with patience and humility, very important, taking advantage of every scrap of information left behind by the work. It was in the same spirit as an attentive worker that I sat down at Mystère's bedside. This initial line of thought is intended as a tribute to John. The Abbey of St. John in Mystère, located in the province of Rhaetia Prima, is in a Frankish zone, was founded by Charlemagne in 775. The choice of location was strategic. At the foot of several alpine passes and close to the Via Claudia Augusta crossing the Alps, Mystère lay on the border between the Lombard Kingdom and the Duchy of Bavaria, two territories destined to be incorporated into the Frankish kingdom. This was already the case for Lombardy, conquered in 774, and then for Bavaria in 787. Following the administrative reorganization of the province by Charlemagne in 806, the abbey came under the direct authority of the emperor. The church, monastic buildings, and residential areas are truly magnificent in scale. Studies of the buildings have shown that the complex was constructed in a single phase based on a pre-established plan with considerable financial resources that betray imperial involvement and the sovereign's personal interest in the project. While the chronological analysis confirms that the abbey was founded in 775 and dates the construction of the church and buildings to the last quarter of the 8th century, the dating of the paintings remains controversial. The painting work was carried out separately from the construction work. Restores observed that a thin layer of dust had settled between the lime intonaco and the painted layer. Today, the decoration will therefore have little more than the painting itself to go on. Iconographic singularities, such as the exceptional representation of certain scenes or narratives, as well as bricks with figurative tradition, are all possible clues to understanding the project and, by extension, to pinpointing its date. The pictorial program designed for the Abbey Church is commensurate with the architectural ambition. All the walls were painted at great expense. Restores have observed the intensive use of precious pigments, including lapis lazuli. The resources mobilized in this setting confirm the emperor's involvement in the commission and the immense interest he took in it. The west facade is decorated with the Last Judgment. Christ sits enthroned among angels and apostles, surrounded by the resurrection of the dead, the separation between the elect and the damned. Paradise and hell, the second coming, and the rolling up of the heavens. On the east facade, above the late Gothic vaults, Christ ascends to heaven, flanked by the personifications of Sol and Luna in the presence of the apostles. In the cul-de-four of the main apse, Christ is again depicted triumphant, standing holding the scepter and the open book, surrounded by the heavenly court and the tetramorph. The underlying walls are devoted to episodes from the life of Saint John the Baptist, patron saint of the abbey. In the north apse, a traditional legis et clavum occupies the cul-de-four. We will return to this shortly. While scenes from the Roman life of Saint Peter and Saint Paul, and probably their martyrdom, adorn the walls. These paintings were redone in the 12th century. To the south, the cul-de-four is decorated with a crux gemmata depicting Christ, the Virgin Mary, Saint Peter, and Saint Paul. The walls are reserved for the life of a local saint, Vigilius, Bishop of Trent, and evangelizer of Rhaetia, martyred in 405 in the Rendener Valley near Münster. On the north and south walls of the nave, the history of salvation unfolds in 5 registers from top to bottom. The cycle of David at the top is followed by the life of Christ, which occupies 3 registers. The story continues with the disciples of Christ who lives and martyrdoms fulfill the mission entrusted to them, the evangelization of the nations. Thus, the sacred history illustrated in Münster is read from top to bottom in 5 spirals that literally unfold from southeast to southeast, from David to Vigilius. In this short communication, I propose to focus on one aspect, the representation of Christ with apostle in the North Alps. The image presents significant iconographic singularities, both in terms of the commission and its intentions, and in terms of the dating of the wall. In this scene, Christ in the center hands over his powers to the first apostles and his representatives on earth, the keys to Saint Peter, the book to Saint Paul. This is a modified version of an ancient iconographic formula of early Christian origin, which enjoyed a resurgence of interest during the Gregorian Reform. This motif is referred to by art historians, sometimes incorrectly, as traditio legis et clavem. Compared to the model, the Carolingian scheme introduces several alterations. Firstly, the order of the apostles is reversed. In Münster, Saint Peter occupies Christ's right hand, whereas this place was originally reserved for Saint Paul. Traditionally, Christ's right hand is more honorable than his left. The Carolingian reversal, therefore, elevates Saint Peter at the expense of Saint Paul. The second change concerns the nature of the event itself. In Münster, unlike in the ancient model, the transfer of power is explicit. Christ places the keys, symbolizing power over souls, and the book, symbolizing the power of preaching, in the hands of the apostles. This interpretation of the early Christian traditio legis, which seems to have crystallized in Münster, enjoyed uneven success in the Middle Ages and remained confined to the Germanic and/or imperial sphere. Rarely depicted after Charlemagne and relatively little known, the motif became more widespread and gained visibility under the Ottonians. In the second half of the 12th century, it was particularly popular with emperors. It can be found on several church portals in the Duchy of Swabia, which were rebuilt with the support and supervision of Frederick Barbarossa. The original motif seems to have disappeared for several centuries before reappearing in the second half of the 11th century, for example, in Rome and its surrounding region. The geopolitical distribution of the motif in Rome and the pro-papal territories for the original version, and in the Germanic territories under the emperor for the modified version, seems to me to reveal the political significance of the theme. Its evolution from the 9th to the 13th century accompanied the debates between the papacy and the empire over their respective places and roles in the church. Much debated by art historians, the meaning of the motif finds an initial explanation in a letter dated 1069, addressed by Peter Damian to Desiderius of Monte Cassino. Observing the resurgence of the traditio legis, Desiderius was concerned about the secondary place reserved for Saint Peter, placed to the left of Christ. To justify the position of each, Peter Damian put forward several arguments, including that of symbolic representation. Through their respective histories, Saint Peter embodies the present and active life, while Saint Paul represents the contemplative life. As the contemplative life is considered superior to the active life, it is therefore right that St. Paul should occupy the right hand of Christ. By validating St. Paul's preeminence over St. Peter in their relationship with God, Peter Damian affirmed the superiority of the spiritual over the temporal, and implicitly that of the religious order over the secular order. This interpretation was undoubtedly not lost on the popes and supporters of church reform, who exploited the argument of seniority and the figurative medium to promote their ideas. The political significance of the motif was certainly not lost on the Carolingians and their successors at the head of the empire either. The changes they made to it or reproduce are all the more significant because they affect an image whose antiquity should have guaranteed its immutability. When the painter of Münster reversed the order of the apostles and placed St. Peter on Christ's right and St. Paul on his left, it was the temporal that prevailed over the spiritual. Moreover, because Peter and Paul are the first apostles and Christ's representatives on earth, they designate the heads of the church, the Frankish king or emperor with St. Peter, the bishop or pope with St. Paul. In this modified version, perhaps designed especially for Münster, the iconographic formula promotes the king and privileges him in his relationship with God, to the detriment of the papacy. Another modification of the motif, which clarifies the nature of their respective powers, takes on the appearance of a veritable political scandal. Here, St. Paul receives the book, a sign of the power of preaching, but it is St. Peter who receives the keys, who is entrusted with the care of souls, the power to lead them to salvation. Through Peter, it is therefore the emperor who occupies the first place in the social hierarchy as the true head of the church. This motif provides us with an argument for dating the Münster paintings. It was only at a specific moment in history, during the reign of Charlemagne, that the sovereign was able to rival the Pope in his role as head of the church. Charlemagne embodied this role when he personally intervened in religious affairs and doctrinal definitions. From this point of view, the council he convened and presided over in 794 in Frankfurt am Main marked a turning point in his political thinking and exercise of power. At this council, the assembly, composed of bishops and abbots from his kingdom, ruled on two religious issues that were then stirring up the whole of Christendom. It condemned adoptionism and opposed the recent decision of the Second Council of Nicaea, which was favorable to images. By endorsing the doctrinal dossier compiled by Carolingian theologians, the Council's decisions affirmed its autonomy from the Pope, who had expressed very different views on the question of images. Already latent since the anointing of Pippin the Short in 751, the idea of the Frankish people as a new chosen people, after the Hebrews, now came into its own. At the end of the 8th century, other signs pointed to the political shift that had taken place during Charlemagne's reign. We might mention, for example, the letter that the advisor Alcuin wrote to Charlemagne from 798 onwards, in which he attributed all powers of coercion and preaching to the Frankish king. Through his Admonitio Generalis of 802, he sought to control the orthodoxy of his people and their way of life. His admonitions were addressed to the Pope himself. Leo III was certainly an intercessor with God, as Charles acknowledged in his letter of 794, but it was Charles who was responsible for the souls of the people. He considered himself the head and controller of the church, the one whose mission was to gather the people and keep them united in the faith until the return of Christ at the end of time. Finally, let us mention the exceptional formula of the Laudes Regiae, composed between 796 and 800. The final acclamation of the Laetania Italica are rearranged so as to place King Charles in first position, relegating Pope Leo to last place. This golden age of royal and imperial authority, symbolized by the Traditio Legis of Münster, was short-lived and came to an end with the death of Charlemagne in 814. His successor, Louis the Pious, lacked his father's stature and political genius. In 822, during the penance imposed on him by the bishops, then by the Council of Soissons in 829, the king was relegated to a subordinate role. He governed only the bodies, while souls fell under episcopal jurisdiction. With Michel Lauwers, we can affirm that from Charlemagne to Louis the Pious, ecclesiological models evolved. We moved from a royal theocracy to an episcopal theocracy. As far as Münster is concerned, the political message expressed by the Traditio Legis, therefore, became unthinkable after Charlemagne. A date prior to 814 is required. A final clue present in the image further refined the dating of the painting project. Here, the act of transmission of powers is clearly expressed, and this transmission takes place directly from Christ to his representatives on earth without mediation. The image echoes the imperial coronation of Charlemagne in 800. According to several accounts, Charlemagne was deeply displeased by the ritual. One reason for his discontent was the manner in which Leo III conducted the ceremony, specifically his decision to crown the chosen candidate himself. Through this highly political gesture, the Pope claimed the power to make sovereigns and set himself up as a mediator between God and the chosen candidate. Charlemagne's entourage reacted to this event. In the letter he sent to the sovereign immediately after the coronation, Alcuin repeatedly referred to the divine origin of royal power. Imperial dignity, he asserted, is ordained by God, ad Deo ordinata, to those whom he chooses. By demonstrating the primacy of royal power in the leadership of the Church and its divine origin, the Traditio Legis of Münster and undoubtedly the entire painted program bear witness to the negative reception of the events of the imperial coronation. The image thus becomes the appropriate medium, the most relevant response. It answers to another image displayed in the Papal Palace, which shows the papal ecclesiological conception and the Pope's view of world governance. It was in this large dining hall, with its imposing dimensions and sumptuous decor, that Leo III welcomed Charlemagne on the feast of St. Andrew on 30 November 800. Also, the triclinium did not survive. The renovation of the Patriarchate beginning in the last quarter of the 16th century, we still have a copy visible since 1743 on the Lateran Square, depicting the main apse and its decor. While the degree of fidelity of the facsimile to the original is debated, particularly with regard to the left side of the triumphal arch, Several art historians, Osborne, Krauteimer, Jacobini, agree that the original work closely resembled it. In the Cul de Four, the risen Christ sent his apostles to the nations to evangelize them. On the left side of the triumphal arch, Christ distributes his power to Saint Peter, or rather Pope Sylvester, depicted on his right, and to Constantine on his left. On the right side of the triumphal arch, the authenticity of the facsimile is less disputed. We see Saint Peter handing the insignia of their powers to Leo III on his right and to Charles on his left. The pallium to the former, symbol of spiritual power, and the labarum to the later, symbol of temporal power. According to Osborne, the symmetrical composition of the two scenes on the triumphal arch aims to produce a symmetry of meaning. Through the figurative medium, the Pope manifests his intention to assimilate Charlemagne to a new Constantine. Charlemagne, like Constantine, receives his temporal power from Saint Peter and therefore from the popes, his successors, in accordance with the logic of the false donation of Constantine. In general, the entire decoration depicts the new alliance between the papacy and the Frankish kingdom, as interpreted by the Pope, who's commissioned the mosaic. Leo III and Charlemagne are designated as successors to Peter in the apostolic mission of evangelizing the world from an eschatological perspective. And the fulfillment of this mission, however, pontifical ecclesiology gives primacy to the papacy, which makes kings and confines them to their role as military leaders in the service of the church. The Muster program is of a completely different nature. The history of the church and of salvation, which unfold there in 5 interlocking cycles, is dominated by David, that is the emperor. Since the Merovingians, and more markedly since the anointing of Pippin the Short in 751, the Frankish sovereigns have been identified with David. In Muster, through the figure of David, Charlemagne appears as the one who dominates and supervises the church, the one who gives it its movement and direction, guiding and supervising the chosen people of whom he is king until the end of time and the return of Christ. With its unique iconography, the traditional legis et clavem in Muster is a key element in understanding the painted program and provides several strong arguments in favor of dating it to around 800. The abbey was a direct initiative of Charlemagne. The sovereign takes his most eminent advisors, theologians and actors in his religious policy, with designing a visual system capable of revealing the pontifical ecclesiology that Leo III had implemented in Rome in terms of ritual, architecture, and imagery. A later legend engraved in the 15th century on the stucco statue of Charlemagne presents the emperor as the founder of the monastery upon his return from his Roman coronation in 801. Although documentation shows that the foundation actually dates back to 775, this mention should not be considered purely anecdotal. It could reflect the memory of a second phase of the project, specifically that of the decorative program designed for an imperial abbey. The triclinium of the Latran and the paintings of Muster are among the earliest surviving examples of the Carolingian revival of forms and techniques. These two works, created in competing spheres of power, are examples of political art. each in its own way contributes to the display of authority and the definition of primacy between Pope and Emperor. There are prime examples of how rivalry between powers and socio-political issues were decisive drivers of medieval artistic innovation, influencing iconographic choices and monumental ambitions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. If I can ask our speaker to come to the front, please. Richard, there you are. So we don't have a roving microphone, which is a nuisance. It can't be helped. So I'd ask respondents to speak up. I'd ask questioners, I beg your pardon, to speak up very loudly. I've seen the first question at the back. Is that a question or is that like at an auction?